Before we begin tonight's story, I want to take just a moment to say thank you. If you're enjoying what you hear, using your hype points on this video truly helps the channel more than you could possibly know. It makes a genuine difference in allowing us to continue creating these stories for you. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review helps tremendously as well. And if you feel like it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in. And of course, if you enjoy the content and haven't already, consider subscribing. It means everything. Now, let's begin. There are moments in history when mercy appears where logic says it should not. When kindness walks through doors that fear has locked. When someone broken by the past is suddenly called forward into a future they never imagined possible. This is one of those stories. It begins not with triumph but with ash. Not with celebration, but with silence. Not with a throne, but with a crippled boy, a hidden life, and a king who refused to forget. Grace often arrives where shame has settled in, and in ancient Israel, during the blood-soaked years following civil war, grace arrived at a table set for the forgotten. Chapter 1. A House in Ruins. The house of Saul had fallen, not slowly, not quietly. It collapsed like a tower struck at its foundation, and when the dust cleared there was almost nothing left. King Saul, the first anointed ruler of Israel, was dead. His sons were dead. His army was scattered. His legacy, once golden, was now stained with madness, jealousy, and the tragic arc of a man who had lost the favour of God. The Philistines had come like locusts. They swept across the hills of Gilboa, their chariots grinding through the dirt roads, their swords flashing in the sunlight. Saul's army tried to hold. They fought with desperation, but desperation is not strategy. One by one, the warriors fell, the king's sons fell, and finally, wounded and surrounded, Saul himself fell on his own sword rather than be captured alive. The news travelled fast. In the royal household, panic erupted. Servants fled. Advisors disappeared into the countryside. Relatives gathered what they could carry and scattered like seeds in a storm. To be connected to Saul now was not an honour. It was a death sentence. David had been anointed king long before Saul's death. He had been hunted by Saul, driven into caves, forced to live among enemies. But David had never stopped being loyal to the throne itself. He had never raised his hand against the anointed king. And now, with Saul gone, David was the rightful heir. But the family of Saul did not see it that way. They saw only danger. In the ancient world, when a new king rose, the old royal line was often erased. Wives, children, distant cousins, anyone with a claim to the throne could be seen as a threat. It was not cruelty. It was survival. It was politics written in blood. History was filled with such purges. When dynasties changed hands, the former royal families rarely survived. It was understood that to allow them to live was to plant seeds of future rebellion. A surviving prince could rally loyalists. A remaining heir could become a symbol for the discontented. And so, kings acted preemptively, not out of personal hatred necessarily, but out of cold political calculation. The household of Saul understood this reality all too well. They had seen how kingdoms operated. They knew the unspoken rules of power, and now, with David ascending to the throne, they expected the worst. So they ran. Some fled north, to all the territories still loyal to Saul's memory. Others went east, crossing the Jordan River into lands less controlled by David's authority. Still others simply vanished into the countryside, taking new names, burying their royal connections, hoping that distance and time would erase the threat they represented. And among those who fled was a young boy named Mephibosheth. Chapter 2. The Child Who Fell. Mephibosheth was only 5 years old when the news came. His father, Jonathan, was dead. His grandfather, Saul, was dead. The kingdom was collapsing and the household was in chaos. His nurse, perhaps a servant, perhaps a relative, grabbed the boy and ran. She did not stop to pack. She did not pause to plan. She simply ran, clutching the child in her arms, her heart pounding, her mind racing with fear. The roads were crowded with refugees. Other members of the household, servants, guards who had abandoned their posts, farmers fleeing the expected violence, all of them moving in the same direction, away from the centre of power, away from Jerusalem, away from whatever judgment was coming. The nurse held Mephibosheth tightly. He was crying, confused, asking questions she could not answer. Where were they going? When would they come back? Where was his father? She did not tell him the truth. How could she explain to a 5-year-old that his entire world had ended? That his father would never return? That the palace he had known, the life he had lived, was gone forever? She just kept running. And then she fell. Maybe it was the uneven ground. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the weight of the boy combined with the speed of her panic. Maybe she was jostled by the crowd of other fleeing refugees. Whatever the reason, she stumbled, and when she did, Mephibosheth fell from her arms. He hit the ground hard. The impact was devastating. His small body crumpled, his legs twisting beneath him at unnatural angles. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. He screamed, a sound that cut through the chaos of the fleeing crowd. The nurse scrambled to her feet, her own knees scraped and bleeding. She reached for the boy, panic rising in her throat. Around them, people barely paused. Everyone was focused on their own survival, their own escape. No one stopped to help. No one had time. She lifted Mephibosheth back into her arms. He was still crying, clutching at his legs, his face twisted in agony. She could feel the unnatural angles of his limbs, could sense that something terrible had happened, but there was no time to stop, no time to assess, no time to do anything but keep moving. If they stayed on the road, if they slowed down, they risked being caught. They risked being identified. They risked everything. So she kept running, the boy's cries gradually fading into whimpers, then to shocked silence. But the damage was done. The fall had shattered bones in both of his feet and legs. In a world without modern medicine, without proper surgical intervention, without even basic understanding of how to properly set complex fractures, the injuries healed poorly. The bones knit together crookedly, the tendons shortened, the muscles atrophied. By the time they reached safety, weeks later, in a distant town far from Jerusalem, it was clear that Mephibosheth would never walk normally again. His legs, broken and improperly healed, left him crippled. In a world where strength and mobility determined status, where a man's ability to fight or work defined his worth, Mephibosheth was marked from that moment forward. He would not be a warrior like his father. He would not lead armies like his grandfather. He would not stand tall in the courts of kings. He would be the crippled son of a dead prince, hidden away in a forgotten town, living in the shadow of a family that no longer existed. Chapter 3. Living in hiding. The years passed slowly in Lodabar. The name itself means no pasture. It was a place of barrenness, a town on the edge of civilization where people went when they had nowhere else to go. It was dry, distant, and unremarkable, the kind of place you could disappear into and never be found. And that was exactly what Mephibosheth did. He lived quietly in the household of Machir, son of Amiel. Machir was a man of some means, enough to take in, the displaced grandson of a king, enough to provide shelter and food. But it was not charity born of sentimentality. It was obligation. It was loyalty to the memory of Saul and Jonathan. And perhaps it was also insurance. If political winds shifted again, having protected a royal heir might prove valuable. Mephibosheth grew up in this household, but he grew up knowing he was different. Other boys ran through the streets, played at being soldiers, helped their fathers in the fields. He watched from doorways and windows. He moved slowly, painfully, his twisted legs requiring support, requiring assistance, requiring constant accommodation. He kept his head down. He did not speak of his lineage. He did not mention his grandfather's throne or his father's courage. To do so would be to invite danger. To do so would be to remind the world that he was a descendant of Saul, and therefore, in the eyes of many, a potential threat. Word had reached Lodabar over the years about David's reign. The new king had united the tribes. He had defeated the Philistines decisively. He had captured Jerusalem and made it his capital. He had brought stability to a land that had known only chaos. By all accounts, David was a good king, a strong king, a king blessed by God. But to Mephibosheth, these reports only deepened his fear. A strong king was a secure king, and a secure king had no reason to tolerate potential rivals. Every year that passed without incident was, in Mephibosheth's mind, not a sign of safety, but merely a delay of the inevitable. So he lived as though he did not exist. His days were marked by routine. He woke, he ate, he moved slowly through the hours, relying on others for support. He helped where he could, mending things with his hands, offering advice, contributing what little he was able to contribute. But always, there was the underlying sense that he was a burden, that he was taking up space, that he was living on borrowed time in more ways than one. His disability was not just physical, it shaped how he saw himself. He believed he was less. He believed he was broken. He believed that the fall that had crippled his legs had also crippled his future. Shame became his constant companion, not because anyone told him he was worthless, but because the world around him seemed to confirm it every single day. He could not work like other men. He could not defend himself. He could not provide in the ways that mattered, and so he withdrew further into himself, into the quiet resignation that this was all his life would ever be. The people of Lodabar were not unkind. They nodded to him in the streets. They made small talk when they encountered him, but there was always a distance. He was the crippled stranger living in Makir's house. He was the quiet one who never spoke of where he came from. He was, in every practical sense, a ghost. He did not expect rescue. He did not hope for restoration. He simply survived day by day in a town called No Pasture, waiting for nothing. The loneliness was perhaps the heaviest burden. He had no peers, no true friends. The young men of the town had their own circles, their own camaraderie built around shared labour and shared experiences. Mephibosheth could not participate. He could not join the harvest crews. He could not go on hunting parties. He could not even sit comfortably in the informal gatherings where men traded stories and jokes after the day's work was done. He was always apart, always separate, always other. At night, lying in his small room in Makir's house, he sometimes thought about his father. Jonathan had been a hero. Jonathan had been brave, skilled with a bow, beloved by the people. Jonathan had been the kind of man songs were written about, and Mephibosheth was his son. But what kind of legacy was that? What did it mean to be the son of a hero when you could not even walk properly? What did it mean to carry a famous name when you had to hide that name every single day? The weight of it pressed down on him, the sense that he had disappointed not just his father's memory, but some fundamental expectation of what a man should be. He knew it was not rational. He knew the fall had not been his fault. He had been a child. But shame is not rational. Shame does not care about circumstances. Shame simply settles in and makes itself at home. And so the years continued. 5 years became 10. 10 became 15. Mephibosheth moved from childhood to adolescence to adulthood, all within the confines of Lodabar, all within the narrow boundaries of a life defined by limitation. He married. He had a son named Micah. These were small joys, small anchors of normalcy. But even these blessings were tinged with sadness. He watched his son grow, watched him learn to walk with ease, watched him run and jump and do all the things Mephibosheth could not do. And while he loved his son fiercely, there was also a quiet grief that he could not be the kind of father he wanted to be. He could not chase Micah through the streets. He could not lift him onto his shoulders. He could not teach him to fight or hunt or do any of the things fathers typically passed on to their sons. He provided what he could: love, presence, wisdom gained from years of quiet observation. But it never felt like enough. And always, beneath everything, was the fear. The fear that someday someone would remember. Someone would make the connection. Someone would whisper to King David that Saul's grandson was alive, living in Lodabar. And then the soldiers would come. He had nightmares about it sometimes. The sound of marching feet, the knock on the door, the rough hands dragging him before the king, the sword falling. He never told anyone about these dreams. What would be the point? Fear was his private burden, carried silently, accepted as the price of survival. Chapter 4. David remembers a promise. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, King David sat on the throne of Israel. He had united the tribes. He had defeated the Philistines. He had brought the Ark of God back to the city. He had established his rule with wisdom, strength, and the favour of heaven. The people loved him. The kingdom was at peace. And yet, in the quiet moments, David's mind drifted backward. He thought of Jonathan. Jonathan, the son of Saul, had been David's closest friend. They had made a covenant together, a bond deeper than politics, stronger than blood. It was not a casual friendship. It was the kind of connection that shapes a life, that leaves a permanent mark on the soul. David remembered the first time they had truly seen each other. It was after David had killed Goliath, when the shepherd boy was brought before King Saul. Jonathan had been there, watching this young man who had done what trained warriors would not do, and something had happened in that moment. A recognition, a kinship. The text says Jonathan's soul was knit to David's soul. It was immediate, it was profound, and it changed both of their lives. Jonathan had protected David when Saul's jealousy turned to murderous rage. Jonathan had warned David when his father planned to kill him. Jonathan had risked his own safety, his own relationship with his father, his own claim to the throne, all to keep David alive. They had made a covenant. They had sworn before God that their loyalty to each other would extend to their descendants, that no matter what happened, no matter how politics shifted, they would protect each other's families. And then Jonathan had died. David had mourned deeply. He had written a lament, one of the most beautiful expressions of grief in all of Scripture. How the mighty have fallen, he had written. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant have you been to me. Your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of women. But mourning is not the same as remembering. Grief is not the same as action. And for years David had been consumed with the demands of kingship, building a capital, establishing a government, fighting wars, consolidating power. There had been no time to dwell on the past, until now. One day, sitting in the palace, David turned to his servants and asked a question that no one expected. Is there anyone left from the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake? The room grew quiet. The servants exchanged glances. Kindness to the house of Saul? Why would the king do such a thing? Saul had tried to kill him. Saul's family had been his enemies. Saul had driven him into the wilderness, forced him to live in caves, hunted him like an animal for years. And yet here was David, asking not about vengeance, but about mercy, not about eliminating threats, but about honouring a promise. It was unusual, it was unexpected, it was to the servant standing in that room almost incomprehensible. Kings did not usually ask such questions. Kings did not usually seek out the remnants of previous dynasties to bless them. The entire logic of royal succession argued against it. Safety demanded that old claims be extinguished, not nurtured. But David was not asking for political advice. He was asking about a covenant. He was asking about loyalty that transcended politics. He was asking about a promise he had made to his friend, and he intended to keep it. One of the servants spoke up. There was a man named Ziba, a former servant of Saul's household. He might know if anyone remained. David summoned him immediately. When Ziba arrived, he was nervous. Being summoned by the king was never a comfortable experience, especially for someone who had once served the previous dynasty. He entered the throne room cautiously, bowing low, keeping his eyes down. David did not waste time with pleasantries. Are you Ziba? I am your servant, Ziba replied carefully. David leaned forward. Is there anyone left from Saul's house? Anyone at all? Ziba hesitated. This was dangerous territory to reveal information about. Surviving members of Saul's family could be seen as disloyalty to David. But to lie to the king was even more dangerous. He chose his words carefully. There is still a son of Jonathan. He is crippled in both feet. The detail about the disability was deliberate. Ziba was making it clear that this was not a viable threat. A crippled man could not lead a rebellion. A crippled man could not rally an army. A crippled man posed no danger to the throne. But David's response was not what Ziba expected. David's face changed. For a moment the mask of kingship slipped, and there was just a man remembering his friend. Jonathan had a son. Jonathan's line continued. There was someone left to whom he could show the kindness he had promised. "Where is he?" David asked. Ziba swallowed. "In Lo-debar, at the house of Machir, son of Amiel." Lo-debar, the middle of nowhere, the kind of place you went to hide, the kind of place you went when you were afraid. David stood. "Bring him to me." Chapter 5. The Summons. When the messengers arrived in Lo-debar, Mephibosheth's world tilted. It was an ordinary day. He was sitting in the courtyard of Machir's house, working on a small repair job, when he heard the commotion in the street. The sound of horses, the sound of voices, the sound of authority. His heart began to race even before he knew why. Machir came into the courtyard, his face pale. Behind him were men in the livery of the king, royal messengers, armed, official. They had come. After all these years, after all this time, they had finally come. "Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan," one of the messengers asked formally. He could not speak. He could barely breathe. He managed a nod. "You're summoned to Jerusalem, to appear before King David." The words hung in the air. Summoned. Jerusalem. King David. This was it. This was the moment he had feared his entire life. David had finally remembered. David had finally decided to finish what political necessity demanded. The last living son of Jonathan, the last thread connecting the house of Saul to the throne, was being called in to be removed. Machir tried to interject. "Perhaps there has been a mistake. Perhaps." "There is no mistake," the messenger said firmly. "The king has called for him. We leave tomorrow." That night Mephibosheth barely slept. He said goodbye to his wife, to his son. He tried to be brave, tried to hide his fear, but they could all see it. They all knew what this meant. His wife held him and wept. "Maybe it will be all right," she whispered. "Maybe the king means no harm." But they both knew she was trying to convince herself as much as him. In the morning the messengers were ready. They had brought a cart for him, understanding that he could not travel on horseback. Even this small accommodation felt ominous. They were making sure he arrived. They were making sure he could not escape. The journey to Jerusalem was long and humiliating. Mephibosheth sat in the back of the cart, his twisted legs stretched out before him, his body jolting with every bump in the road. The messengers rode alongside, silent and professional. They did not speak to him. They did not explain. They simply escorted him, like a prisoner being transported to judgment. He watched the landscape change as they travelled. The barren hills of Lo-debar gave way to more fertile land. They passed through villages and towns. They crossed rivers, and with each mile Jerusalem drew closer. He had never been to Jerusalem. He had been too young when his family fled. All he knew of it came from reports and stories. It was the city David had conquered, the city that had become the heart of the kingdom, the city where power resided, and now he was going there to die. At night when they camped, he lay awake staring at the stars. He thought about his father. He wondered if Jonathan would be ashamed of him. He wondered if his father had imagined in those final moments on the battlefield that his son would end up like this, crippled, afraid, summoned to an execution. He thought about his own son, Micah. What would become of the boy? Would the king's vengeance extend even to the next generation? Or would Micah be spared because he was too young, too insignificant to matter? These thoughts circled endlessly, offering no comfort, no resolution. As they approached Jerusalem, the roads became more crowded. Merchants travelling to the capital, pilgrims coming to worship, soldiers on patrol. The city itself rose before them, walls gleaming in the sunlight, gates standing open but guarded. They passed through without incident. The messengers clearly had authority. Guards nodded them through, and then they were inside, moving through streets Mephibosheth had only imagined, heading toward the palace. When he finally arrived at the palace, the weight of the moment crushed him. The building was enormous, grand, intimidating. Everything about it spoke of power and permanence. This was not just a house. This was the seat of a kingdom. This was where decisions of life and death were made. The guards led him into the throne room. The walls were high. The ceiling echoed with voices. Courtiers and officials moved about, conducting the business of the kingdom. And at the far end of the hall, seated on the throne, was King David. Mephibosheth had never seen David before. He had imagined him countless times, imagined him as a giant, as a warrior, as a figure of terror. But the man on the throne looked almost ordinary, older than Mephibosheth expected. Lines on his face, grey in his beard, but the eyes. The eyes were what caught Mephibosheth's attention. They were intelligent, piercing, the eyes of someone who saw everything, and right now they were looking directly at him. Mephibosheth fell to the ground. He did not kneel gracefully. He collapsed, face down, arms outstretched, trembling. His legs, useless as always, splayed awkwardly beneath him. He could not look up. He could not speak. He simply waited for the sword to fall. The throne room continued its business around him, but he heard none of it. His entire world had narrowed to this moment, this spot on the floor, this final breath before the end. Then he heard footsteps. Someone was approaching, coming down from the throne, walking toward him. "Mephibosheth," a voice said gently. The sound of his own name startled him. It was not harsh. It was not angry. It was almost kind. He forced himself to speak, his voice barely audible. "I am your servant." Chapter 6. Mercy at the Throne. David stood before the prostrate man and felt a wave of emotion he had not anticipated. This was Jonathan's son, the boy Jonathan had loved, the child Jonathan had held. And now, here he was, broken, terrified, expecting death. David's mind flashed back to conversations with Jonathan. His friend had spoken of his son sometimes, in the brief moments of peace between battles. Jonathan had loved the boy fiercely, had wanted so much for him, had dreamed of the kind of man he might become, and now, because of politics and fear and the cruel mathematics of power, that boy had grown up in hiding, believing himself to be hunted. David's heart broke. "Do not be afraid," he said. Mephibosheth's body tensed at the words. Do not be afraid. How could he not be afraid? He was the grandson of Saul. He was the last living reminder of a dynasty that had fallen. He was a threat, whether he wanted to be or not. But David continued, his voice steady and warm. "I will show you kindness for the sake of your father, Jonathan." Mephibosheth's mind struggled to process the words. Kindness? For Jonathan's sake? Was this some kind of trick? Some cruel joke before the execution? David kept speaking, and with every word the impossible became real. "I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, all the fields, all the property. It is yours again, and you will always eat at my table." The throne room seemed to spin. Mephibosheth's thoughts tumbled over each other, unable to form coherence. Not execution, not exile, not even tolerance, restoration, invitation, a place at the king's table. Around the throne room, courtiers had stopped their conversations. Officials had paused their business. Everyone was watching. This was unprecedented. This was extraordinary. David motioned to his servants. "Help him up." Hands reached down, gently lifting Mephibosheth from the floor. He stood shakily, his legs barely supporting him, his whole body trembling. He looked at David, really looked at him for the first time, and what he saw in the king's face was not anger or calculation or political manoeuvring. It was genuine compassion. Mephibosheth bowed his head, his voice shaking. "What is your servant, that you should notice a dead dog like me?" The phrase was not false humility. It was genuine. In that moment, Mephibosheth believed every word. He saw himself as worthless, as beneath notice, as something to be discarded. A dead dog. That was how he understood his place in the world. A dead dog had no value. A dead dog could not serve. A dead dog was less than nothing, not even alive enough to be useful. That was how deeply shame had rooted itself in his identity. But David's face changed. He stepped closer, looking Mephibosheth directly in the eyes. "You are the son of my covenant brother," David said firmly. "You are Jonathan's son. That is who you are. And I made a promise." He turned to the assembled court. "Let it be known, Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, is restored. All that belonged to Saul is his. He will live in Jerusalem, and he will eat at my table as one of my own sons." Then David called for Ziba. The servant appeared quickly, bowing low. David's instructions were clear and detailed. "You and your sons and your servants will work the land that belonged to Saul. The produce will support Mephibosheth and his household, but Mephibosheth himself will always eat at my table." Ziba bowed. "As the king commands." Mephibosheth stood there, unable to fully comprehend what had just happened. His entire life, every assumption he had made, every fear he had carried, every belief about his identity, it was all being rewritten in this moment. He had come expecting death and received life. He had come expecting judgment and received mercy. He had come carrying shame and was being offered honour. Chapter 7. A New Identity. The adjustment was not immediate. In the days following the throne room encounter, Mephibosheth moved through his new life in a kind of daze. He was given rooms in the palace. Servants attended to his needs. He was provided with clothes befitting his new status. Everything had changed. But inside he still felt like the man from Lo-debar, the crippled grandson hiding in no pasture, the one who did not belong. The first time he was called to dinner at the king's table, his hands shook so badly he could barely hold his cup. He sat among David's sons, grown men, warriors, princes, and felt like an imposter. They were polite. They welcomed him. But he could feel their curiosity. Who was this crippled stranger their father had elevated? Why was he here? David, at the head of the table, seemed to sense his discomfort. He engaged Mephibosheth in conversation, asking about his life, his family, his son Micah. Nothing heavy, nothing that required Mephibosheth to perform, just genuine interest. Slowly, over the course of that first meal, something inside Mephibosheth began to soften. These men were not his enemies. David was not his executioner. This was real. This was actually happening. Still, old patterns are hard to break. That night, alone in his room, he waited for the other shoe to drop. He waited for someone to come and tell him it was all a mistake. He waited for the conditions to be revealed. Surely David wanted something in return. Surely there was a price. But no one came. The next day was the same, and the day after. That. And the day after that. Every evening, without exception, he sat at the king's table and ate alongside David's sons. He listened to their conversations. He watched the way David led with wisdom and grace. He saw the king laugh with his children, discuss matters of state, settle disputes, offer counsel. And slowly something inside him began to shift. One evening, several weeks after his arrival, one of David's younger sons asked him about his injury. It was an innocent question, asked without malice, just curiosity. Mephibosheth found himself telling the story. The flight from Jerusalem, the nurse who carried him, the fall, the years in Lo-debar. When he finished, there was silence around the table. Then David spoke. "You have carried that burden for a long time." Mephibosheth nodded, unsure what to say. "But it does not define you," David continued. "Your legs may be crippled, but your heart is not. Your body may be broken, but your spirit does not have to be." It was such a simple statement, but it landed with the force of revelation. Your legs may be crippled, but your heart is not. Mephibosheth had spent his entire adult life believing that his disability disqualified him from mattering, that his inability to walk properly meant he had nothing to offer, that his brokenness made him less than human. But David was saying something different. David was saying that physical limitation did not equal personal worthlessness, that what was broken in his body did not have to be broken in his identity. That night, for the first time in years, Mephibosheth slept peacefully. The transformation did not happen overnight. It happened in small moments, accumulated over weeks and months. It happened when David asked his opinion on a matter and actually listened to his response. It happened when David's sons began to treat him not as a charity case, but as a brother. It happened when he realized he could contribute, not through physical labor, but through wisdom, through presence, through being part of something larger than himself. His legs were still crippled. That had not changed. When he walked, he still limped. When he moved, he still struggled. But the way he saw himself began to transform. He was no longer defined by what had been taken from him. He was no longer defined by the fall that had broken his body. He was no longer the forgotten son of a fallen house. He was a guest at the king's table. He was honoured. He was provided for. He was loved. Not because he had earned it. Not because he was strong or capable or useful, but because the king had made a promise, and the king kept his word. He sent for his wife and son. They came to Jerusalem, uncertain and afraid at first, but David welcomed them warmly. Micah, his son, was given opportunities Mephibosheth had never dreamed possible. The boy could train with weapons. He could learn from the king's advisors. He could grow up free from the fear and shame that had defined his father's life. Watching his son flourish, Mephibosheth felt a gratitude so deep it was almost painful. This was what grace did. It did not just rescue the individual, it broke cycles, it opened futures, it gave back what had been stolen. Months became years. Mephibosheth's place at the table became permanent. It became normal. The courtier stopped whispering about it. The servant stopped treating him as unusual. He simply was part of the household. And in that normality, in that acceptance, Mephibosheth found something he had never known before. Peace. Chapter 8. Grace that endures. But peace is not the same as the absence of challenge, and the years that followed would test everything Mephibosheth had learned. The kingdom faced new challenges. David's reign, for all its success, was not without turmoil. His family life was complicated. His sons competed for favour, and eventually, inevitably, rebellion came. Absalom, David's son, was ambitious and charismatic. He was also angry at his father, at the way justice had been handled in certain matters, at feeling overlooked. That anger grew into conspiracy. Conspiracy grew into open rebellion. Absalom gathered an army. He positioned himself as the rightful king, the one who would bring justice and order. And shockingly, he gained support. Many in Israel, for various reasons, chose to follow him. David was forced to flee Jerusalem, again. Just as he had fled from Saul decades earlier, he now fled from his own son. It was a devastating blow, and it threw the entire kingdom into chaos. The political landscape became treacherous. Loyalties were tested. Old wounds reopened. Those who had been close to David had to make choices. Would they stay with the king in his exile, or would they hedge their bets, stay in Jerusalem, see which way the wind blew? In the midst of this chaos, Mephibosheth faced his own crisis. He wanted desperately to go with David. David had saved his life, had given him everything, had shown him mercy, beyond measure. Loyalty demanded that he stand with the king, but his legs would not allow it. David and his loyalists were moving quickly, travelling light, prepared to fight if necessary. Mephibosheth could not keep pace. He could not travel on horseback. He could not march with an army. He was once again limited by his body. He made arrangements to follow as quickly as he could. He prepared provisions. He gathered what he needed. But it would take time. He would be behind. He would be slow. And in that window of time, Ziba made his move. Ziba, the servant who had been managing Saul's lands on Mephibosheth's behalf, saw an opportunity. He went to David during the king's flight, bringing donkeys loaded with supplies, bread, wine, fruit. David was grateful. Supplies were desperately needed. "Where is Mephibosheth?" David asked. Ziba's answer was carefully calculated. He has stayed in Jerusalem. He believes that the house of Israel will restore his grandfather's kingdom to him in the chaos. It was a lie, a complete fabrication, but it was a believable lie. In times of rebellion, anyone with a royal claim might be tempted to seize power, and Mephibosheth, as Saul's grandson, technically had such a claim. David, exhausted and betrayed on every side, believed Ziba's words. In that moment, surrounded by treachery, it seemed plausible. It seemed like just one more betrayal in a long line of betrayals. He turned to Ziba. "Everything that belonged to Mephibosheth is now yours." Ziba bowed, hiding his satisfaction. He had gambled and won. Meanwhile, back in Jerusalem, Mephibosheth knew nothing of this conversation. He was still trying to leave, still trying to catch up to David's company, his progress agonizingly slow. When he finally realized he could not reach David in time, when he understood that the king had already left the area and he had no way of knowing where David had gone, Mephibosheth made a decision. He would wait, he would stay loyal, he would not groom himself, would not wash his clothes, would not present himself as though everything was normal. He would mourn David's absence, he would pray for the king's return, and he would trust that somehow, someday, the truth would be known. The weeks that followed were agony. Absalom controlled Jerusalem. His supporters filled the palace. The city that had become Mephibosheth's home was now occupied by those who opposed the man who had saved him. Every day was a test of faith. Every day required him to trust that David would survive, that David would return, that the grace he had been shown was real and permanent and not dependent on circumstance. Finally news came. David's forces had won. Absalom was dead. The rebellion was crushed. The king was returning to Jerusalem. Mephibosheth wept with relief. He prepared to meet David, but he did not change his appearance. He had not groomed himself the entire time David was gone. His clothes were unwashed. His hair was unkempt. He looked like what he was, a man in mourning, a man who had refused to accept the new order, a man whose loyalty had never wavered. When David entered Jerusalem, Mephibosheth went out to meet him. He moved as quickly as his legs would allow, pushing through the crowds, desperate to see the king. David saw him coming, and the king's face hardened. "Mephibosheth," David said, his voice cold, "why did you not go with me?" The question hit like a physical blow. Mephibosheth's heart sank. What had happened? Why was David angry? "My lord the king," Mephibosheth said quickly, "my servant deceived me. I intended to come with you. I told him to prepare a donkey so I could ride with you, for your servant is lame. But he left without me, and then he slandered me to you." The pieces began to fall into place. Mephibosheth continued, his words tumbling out. "I know you are wise like an angel of God. I know you see truth. Whatever you decide, I will accept. You saved my life when I had no reason to expect anything but death. If you believe I betrayed you, then judge me. But know this, I have been loyal. I have mourned your absence. I have never stopped believing in you." David looked at him carefully. He saw the unwashed clothes. He saw the unkempt appearance. He saw the evidence of genuine mourning. Ziba had lied. Clearly. Completely. But the situation was complicated. David had already given Mephibosheth's property to Ziba as a reward. To reverse that completely would be to admit a serious error in judgment. It would be politically messy. It would open questions about David's discernment. David made a decision, perhaps not the perfect one, but a practical one. You and Ziba divide the land between you. It was not full justice, but it was something. It was a recognition that Mephibosheth had been wronged without completely humiliating Ziba or admitting the full extent of the mistake. Mephibosheth's response was immediate and telling. "Let him take it all," he said. "I am just glad. My lord the king has returned safely to his house." In that moment, David saw what Mephibosheth had become. This was not the terrified, shame-filled man who had been brought before the throne years earlier. This was not someone clinging desperately to property or status. This was a man who had been transformed by grace. A man who understood that his worth was not tied to what he owned or what he was owed. A man whose identity was secure enough that he could release his rights without losing himself. Let him take it all. I am just glad you're back." That was the heart of a man who had learned what mercy meant, who had internalized grace so deeply that he could extend it to others, even to someone who had wronged him. David nodded slowly, seeing and understanding. Mephibosheth remained at the king's table. The land was divided as David had decreed, but it barely mattered. What mattered was the relationship. What mattered was the covenant. What mattered was that grace, once given, had proven itself to be unshakable. Even in political turmoil, even in betrayal and accusation, even when tested by circumstance and misunderstanding, the grace remained. Because grace is not based on performance, it is based on promise. And David had made a promise to Jonathan that transcended everything else. Epilogue. The table. Still set years later, when Mephibosheth was an old man, he would sit at David's table and remember. He would remember the fear, the years in Lodabar, the shame that had defined him, the certainty that he would die for the crime of being born into the wrong family. And then he would remember the throne room, the moment when David spoke mercy instead of judgment, the moment when everything changed. His legs never healed. He never walked without difficulty. The scars of his fall remained with him for the rest of his life. When he rose from the table each evening, he still needed assistance. When he moved through the palace, he still limped. But those scars no longer defined him, because grace does not erase the past, it redeems it. Grace does not pretend the pain never happened. It declares that the pain is not the end of the story. Grace does not require perfection. It offers a seat at the table anyway. In the ancient Near East, to eat at a king's table was not a casual thing. It was not just about food. It was a declaration of status. It was a statement of belonging. It was a promise of protection. It meant you were under the king's roof, under his provision, under his care. For Mephibosheth, it meant he was no longer the crippled grandson of a failed king. He was a son of David's household, not by birth, not by right, but by grace. The story of Mephibosheth spread throughout Israel. People told it to their children. They remembered the king who kept his covenant. They remembered the man who had been lifted from hiding and given a place of honour. And in the retelling, the story became more than just history. It became a picture of something deeper, something universal, something that spoke to the human condition itself. Because Mephibosheth's story is not unique. In a spiritual sense, it is everyone's story. We are all crippled, not necessarily physically, but in the ways that matter. We are broken by circumstances beyond our control. We carry shame for things that were not our fault. We hide in barren places because we believe we have nothing to offer. We expect judgment because we cannot imagine mercy. And into that fear, into that shame, into that hiding, comes a summons. Come to the table, not because you've earned it, not because you're strong enough or good enough or capable enough, not because you can walk without limping or contribute without limitation. Just come. There is a place set for you. There has always been a place set for you, not because of who you are, but because of who the king is. The king who keeps covenants, the king who remembers the forgotten, the king who looks at broken people and sees not dead dogs, but beloved children. Mephibosheth lived out his days in Jerusalem at David's table, a living testament to grace. His son Micah grew up free from the shame his father had known. The cycle was broken, the curse was lifted, and at the end of his life, when Mephibosheth looked back over the strange and merciful arc of his story, he understood something profound. The fall that had crippled him had not been the defining moment of his life. The throne room had been the moment when he stopped being defined by his brokenness and started being defined by the king's mercy. That was the moment everything changed. That was the moment he stopped being a dead dog and became a son. This is the echo of a greater truth that resonates through all of time. There is a table still being set, not in an ancient palace, but in the heart of God. And at that table, there is room for the crippled, the ashamed, the fearful, and the forgotten. There is room for those who believe they are worthless. There is room for those who have been hiding in barren places, waiting for nothing, expecting nothing, hoping for nothing. There is room for those who have been broken by falls they did not choose, for those who carry scars that will never fully heal, for those who move through life with a limp. Grace arrives where shame has settled in, and the invitation is not based on what you can offer. It is not based on your strength, or your capability, or your worthiness. It is based on a covenant made long before you were born, a promise kept by a king who does not forget. The table is set. The seat is yours, not because you earned it, but because he remembered. There are moments in history that seem unremarkable at first glance. A king makes a decision, a prophet speaks a warning, a door closes quietly on an opportunity that will never return. But sometimes these small moments reveal something profound about the human condition, about the space between faith and self-reliance, between humility and pride. Tonight's story takes us to the ancient kingdom of Judah, during a period most historians would describe as relatively peaceful. There were no apocalyptic battles, no dramatic exiles, no nation-ending catastrophes. Instead, there was something far more dangerous, a slow drift away from the very foundation that had brought success in the first place. This is the story of Hanani the seer and King Asa of Judah, a narrative about what happens when a leader who once trusted God completely decides that human alliances offer better security than divine faithfulness. It's a story about the test that comes not during crisis but during comfort, and it reveals a truth that echoes across millennia, that faith proven once must be renewed continually, or it withers in the shadow of our own accomplishments. Chapter 1. A king who began well. The reign of Asa began with the kind of promise that makes historians take notice. When he ascended to the throne of Judah, the kingdom was spiritually fractured, morally compromised, and politically vulnerable. His predecessors had allowed the worship of foreign gods to take root in the land, permitted sacred prostitution at pagan shrines, and tolerated practices that violated everything the covenant with God represented. The nation that was supposed to be set apart had become indistinguishable from its neighbours. Asa inherited this mess as a young king, and the expectations were not high. But something in Asa was different. Perhaps it was the influence of his grandmother Maacah, whom he would later remove from her position as queen mother due to her idol worship. Perhaps it was the counsel of faithful priests who had maintained their devotion despite the surrounding corruption. Or perhaps it was simply a genuine encounter with the God of his ancestors that convinced him the old ways needed to be restored. Whatever the catalyst, Asa made a decision that would define the first decades of his rule. He would return Judah to covenant faithfulness regardless of the cost. The reforms began systematically. Asa ordered the removal of foreign altars throughout the kingdom. He broke down the sacred stones that had been erected to Canaanite deities. He cut down the Asherah poles that stood as symbols of fertility goddess worship. These weren't merely symbolic gestures. In the ancient world, removing religious objects was a direct challenge to the power structures that supported them. Priests lost income, influential families lost status, political alliances built on shared worship practices became strained. But Asa pressed forward, convinced that the spiritual health of the nation mattered more than temporary political convenience. He restored the altar of the Lord that stood in front of the temple portico. He called the people to renew their commitment to the covenant. He assembled the nation and led them in sacrifices and celebrations that recalled the faithfulness of God to their ancestors. The chroniclers record that Asa commanded Judah to seek the Lord, the God of their fathers, and to obey his laws and commands. It was comprehensive spiritual renewal, the kind that reshapes not just religious practice but national identity. The result was remarkable. God granted Asa rest on every side. No enemies rose against Judah during these early years. The kingdom experienced peace and prosperity. Asa used this period of stability to fortify the cities of Judah, building up defences and organising the military. He told the people that because they had sought the Lord, God had given them rest, and they built and prospered. But the real test of Asa's faith came not during the reforms, but afterward, when military threat emerged from an unexpected direction. Zerah the Cushite, commanding a massive army, marched against Judah. The numbers were overwhelming. Judah's organised but relatively modest forces faced an invasion force that included hundreds of thousands of soldiers and 300 chariots. By any conventional military calculation, Judah should have been crushed. Asa's response in that moment defined his early reign. He didn't panic. He didn't immediately seek foreign alliances. He didn't try to negotiate a settlement. Instead, he called out to the Lord his God in a prayer that has echoed through history. Lord, there is no one like you to help the powerless against the mighty. Help us, Lord our God, for we rely on you, and in your name we have come against this vast army. Lord, you are our God. Do not let mere mortals prevail against you. It was a prayer of absolute dependence, a public acknowledgement that Judah's survival rested entirely on divine intervention, and God responded. The chroniclers record that the Lord struck down the Cushites before Asa and Judah. The invading army was routed so completely that they could not recover. Judah pursued them and carried off plunder in quantities so vast it took days to collect. They struck down all the surrounding villages, and the fear of the Lord came upon them. This victory established Asa as a king who trusted God, a leader who understood that human strength was insufficient against overwhelming odds. The nation rallied around this narrative. Songs were written about the defeat of Zerah. The temple received generous offerings from the plunder. Asa's reputation as a faithful king spread to neighbouring kingdoms. Everything in his early reign pointed toward a legacy of unwavering trust in divine providence. The kingdom flourished in the aftermath. Trade routes stabilised. Agricultural production increased. The population grew. Jerusalem became more prominent as a religious and political centre. Asa continued building projects, strengthening defences and organising the administration of justice throughout Judah. By every measurable standard, his kingship was succeeding. The reforms had worked. The faith had been vindicated. God had proven faithful. But success has a way of reshaping our understanding of why success occurred. When decades pass between the moment of desperate prayer and the next serious crisis, memory becomes selective. The vivid desperation fades. The overwhelming gratitude softens into comfortable assumption. We begin to believe that our careful planning, our wise administration, our strategic thinking played a larger role than perhaps they did. We forget the prayer that acknowledged powerlessness, and remember instead the victory that proved our strength. Asa ruled in this space of established success for years. The kingdom he governed was stable, prosperous, and secure. His early decisions had created conditions for lasting peace. His spiritual leadership had unified the nation around covenant faithfulness. By the time 35 years of his reign had passed, It would have been easy to believe that Judah's strength was self-sustaining, that the foundation he had built was sufficient to handle whatever challenges might emerge. The reforms were complete, the systems were working, the threats had been neutralized. But faith is not a foundation we build once and walk away from. It is a relationship we maintain daily, a posture we must continually renew, a dependence we either acknowledge or slowly forget. And in the 36th year of Asa's reign, that reality would be tested in a way that revealed how much had changed since the day he faced Zerah's army and cried out to God in desperate faith. Chapter 2. A new threat emerges. The messenger arrived in Jerusalem with news that shifted the political landscape of the entire region. Baasha, king of Israel, had begun fortifying Ramah, a strategic location, just a few miles north of Jerusalem. To understand the significance, you have to grasp the geography. Ramah sat at a critical junction controlling the main road between the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. By fortifying this location, Baasha was effectively establishing a military checkpoint that could control trade, monitor movement, and project power directly toward Jerusalem itself. This wasn't an invasion in the traditional sense. No armies had crossed borders, no battles had been fought. But it was absolutely a hostile act, a strategic move designed to constrain Judah's options and assert Israel's dominance in the region. The fortification of Ramah would prevent anyone from leaving or entering Judah freely. It would disrupt the economic stability Asa had spent decades building. It would make Jerusalem vulnerable to northern aggression in ways that undermined all the defensive preparations Asa had carefully constructed. The situation was serious, but it wasn't hopeless. Judah had resources, the kingdom was stable, the military was well organized, and more importantly, Judah had a history of divine deliverance that dwarfed the current challenge. Asa had faced far worse odds against Zerah's massive invasion force. Compared to that overwhelming threat, Baasha's fortification project was manageable. A king who had once prayed for help against hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers and 300 chariots could surely trust God to handle a construction project in Ramah. But something had changed in Asa during those 35 years of peace and prosperity. The king who once called out to God in desperate dependence now assessed the situation through a different lens. He looked at the problem and saw not an opportunity to trust God again, but a political challenge requiring a political solution. He considered his options with the calculating eye of an experienced administrator rather than the faith-filled heart of a desperate supplicant. Asa turned his attention north, but not toward God. He looked toward Damascus, toward Ben-Hadad, king of Aram. Here was a powerful regional player with his own interests in keeping Israel from becoming too strong. Here was a potential ally with military resources that could pressure Israel from the north, while Judah responded from the south. Here was a practical solution that made perfect strategic sense by the logic of international politics. The plan was straightforward. Asa would send gifts to Ben-Hadad, treasures that would make an alliance attractive. He would appeal to their existing diplomatic relationship and propose a new agreement. If Ben-Hadad attacked Israel from the north, Baasha would be forced to abandon the Ramah project to defend his own territory. The threat would be neutralized without Judah risking a direct military confrontation. It was, by conventional wisdom, a smart move. But there was a problem with the plan, one that Asa either didn't recognize or chose to ignore. The treasures he would send to Ben-Hadad weren't just state assets. They were sacred resources, gifts that had been dedicated to God, stored in the temple treasury and the palace treasuries specifically because they represented the covenant relationship between Judah and the Lord. Using these resources to buy a military alliance was more than just a political maneuver. It was a theological statement, a declaration that the treasures dedicated to God could be repurposed for human schemes when circumstances required it. Asa gathered silver and gold from the temple treasuries and from his own palace treasuries. The amounts were substantial, enough to make Ben-Hadad take notice, enough to shift the balance of regional power. He sent them north with a message carefully crafted to appeal to Ben-Hadad's interests. Let there be a treaty between me and you, as there was between my father and your father. See, I am sending you silver and gold. Now break your treaty with Baasha, king of Israel, so he will withdraw from me. The message revealed Asa's thinking. He wasn't approaching this as a matter requiring divine guidance. He was conducting international diplomacy according to the standard practices of ancient Near Eastern politics. You identify shared interests, offer valuable inducements, and construct agreements that benefit both parties. You leverage existing relationships and create new obligations. You use resources strategically to achieve political objectives. It was all very reasonable, very pragmatic, very much in line with how experienced rulers operated. Ben-Hadad agreed to Asa's proposal. The treasures were persuasive, and the strategic logic was sound. He sent his army commanders against the towns of Israel. They conquered several significant locations, capturing territory and disrupting Israel's northern defences. The news reached Baasha quickly, and as Asa had predicted, the king of Israel was forced to respond. He stopped building Ramah and withdrew his forces to deal with the more immediate threat from Aram. The plan worked. By every conventional measure, Asa's strategy had succeeded. The threat to Jerusalem was neutralized. The fortification of Ramah was abandoned. Asa even took the materials Baasha had been using to build up Ramah and used them to fortify Geba and Mizpah, turning his enemy's resources into his own defensive advantage. The kingdom remained secure. Trade routes stayed open. The crisis passed without Judah suffering any military casualties. In the royal court, Asa's advisors likely praised his wisdom. The political establishment probably viewed it as masterful diplomacy. The people of Jerusalem, unaware of the deeper theological implications, simply felt relieved that the threat had passed without war coming to their doorstep. By the metrics that typically measure royal success, Asa had performed brilliantly. He had identified a problem, formulated a solution, and executed it effectively. The king who had once reformed Judah's spiritual life had now demonstrated equal skill in managing its political challenges. But there was a perspective missing from all these calculations, a voice that would speak uncomfortable truth about what had actually happened. Because while Asa had solved the immediate political problem, he had revealed something far more troubling about the trajectory of his faith. The king who once declared, "Lord, there is no one like you to help the powerless against the mighty," had just demonstrated that he no longer saw himself as powerless. The leader who once relied entirely on God had just bet the temple treasury on a foreign alliance. The man who had taught his nation to trust divine providence above human strength had just written a different lesson entirely, and someone was about to point that out. Chapter 3. The Prophet Speaks. Hanani was not a prominent figure in the royal court. He wasn't one of the advisors who surrounded Asa daily, offering counsel on political matters and military strategy. He wasn't part of the administrative structure that managed the kingdom's affairs. He was a seer, someone who saw things others missed, who perceived spiritual realities beneath political surfaces, who understood that the visible outcomes of human decisions were only part of the story being written. The scriptures give us almost nothing about Hanani's background. We don't know his age, his family connections, or how long he had served as a prophet. We know only that when God needed someone to speak truth to a king who had stopped listening for divine guidance, Hanani was the one called, and he approached Asa not with dramatic thunder or supernatural signs, but with the quiet authority of someone delivering a message he didn't author, but was responsible for communicating. The meeting probably took place in one of the private chambers of the palace, away from the court officials and military commanders who might have defended Asa's strategy. There was no public spectacle, no crowd gathered to witness a prophetic confrontation. Just a king who thought he had handled a crisis well, and a prophet who saw it very differently. Hanani's opening words cut through any pleasantries. Because you relied on the king of Aram and not on the Lord your God, the army of the king of Aram has escaped from your hand. It was a simple observation, but it reframed everything. Asa thought he had neutralized a threat and strengthened Judah's position. Hanani pointed out what Asa had actually done. He had enabled an enemy to grow stronger while demonstrating that Judah no longer trusted God to handle its problems. The immediate crisis with Baasha was resolved, but a larger strategic opportunity had been missed. If Asa had trusted God as he once had, both Baasha's forces and Ben-Hadad's army might have been defeated. Instead, Asa's alliance had simply shifted regional power without actually securing lasting peace. But Hanani wasn't finished. He needed Asa to remember what he seemed to have forgotten. Were not the Cushites and Libyans a mighty army with great numbers of chariots and horsemen? Yet when you relied on the Lord, he delivered them into your hand. This was the heart of the message. Hanani forced Asa to compare two moments in his reign. The first, facing an overwhelming invasion with nothing but desperate faith and a prayer acknowledging powerlessness. The second, facing a fortification project with carefully calculated diplomacy and temple treasures. The first crisis was objectively more dangerous. The second crisis was objectively more manageable. Yet Asa trusted God for the first and trusted human alliances for the second. What had changed? Not the nature of the threat, not God's ability to deliver. What had changed was Asa himself. Success, stability, and years of peace had gradually shifted his understanding of where security actually came from. The king who once knew he was powerless against a mighty army now believed he was powerful enough to solve his own problems. The man who once cried out to God had learned to rely on his own wisdom and resources. Hanani then delivered the theological principle behind his critique, words that would echo far beyond this single conversation. For the eyes of the Lord range throughout the earth to strengthen those whose hearts are fully committed to him. This wasn't about God being angry or vindictive. It was about how divine providence actually works. God actively looks for people whose trust is complete, whose dependence is genuine, whose faith doesn't waver when circumstances stabilize. And when God finds such people, he strengthens them, not because they're perfect, but because their hearts are positioned to receive his help. Asa had removed himself from that category, not by committing some horrible sin, but by becoming self-sufficient in his thinking, by trusting human wisdom over divine faithfulness. The conclusion of Hanani's message was, painful but necessary. You have done a foolish thing, and from now on you will be at war. The word foolish stung. Asa's advisors had probably called his strategy wise. His court had likely praised his diplomatic skill. But from God's perspective, turning away from the one who had delivered Judah from impossible odds to trust a foreign king with temple treasures was foolishness of the deepest kind. It wasn't stupidity. Asa was clearly intelligent. It was the specific kind of folly that comes from trusting created things over the Creator, from believing that human schemes could provide better security than divine faithfulness. And the consequence wasn't divine punishment in the sense of God actively harming Judah. It was the natural result of the choice Asa had made. By demonstrating that Judah would solve its problems through human alliances rather than trust in God, Asa had ensured that Judah would continue facing problems that required constant human maneuvering. The peace that comes from resting in God's provision was replaced with the ongoing anxiety of maintaining political alliances and managing regional powers. From now on there would be wars, not because God ordained them as punishment, but because Asa had chosen to operate in the realm of human conflict rather than divine peace. The message was firm but not cruel. Hanani wasn't condemning Asa's character or declaring him abandoned by God. He was simply holding up a mirror and asking the king to see what he had become. The man who once led Judah back to covenant faithfulness had himself drifted from the very dependence he had once modelled. The reformer needed reform. The leader needed correction. It was the kind of prophetic word designed not to destroy but to restore, not to condemn but to redirect. Hanani had come to give Asa the opportunity to recognize his drift and return to the faith that had once defined his kingship. All Asa had to do was listen, acknowledge the truth of what Hanani was saying, and choose dependence over self-reliance once more. But that's not what happened. Chapter 4. The uncomfortable truth. When prophetic correction lands in the heart of a humble person, it produces repentance. When it lands in the heart of a proud person, it produces rage. Hanani's words weren't harsh by prophetic standards. There were no pronouncements of destruction, no declarations of exile, no dramatic judgments. The message was actually quite measured. You relied on human help instead of a God, and as a result you'll continue dealing with human conflicts instead of experiencing divine peace. It was an observation about consequences, not a vengeful curse. But Asa heard something different. He heard an attack on his wisdom. He heard a challenge to his authority. He heard someone suggesting that his carefully considered strategy was actually foolish, that his diplomatic success was actually a failure, that his leadership had drifted from the foundation that once made it effective. And instead of pausing to consider whether Hanani might be right, Asa reacted with the defensive anger of someone whose self-image has been threatened. The king's response was swift and severe. He had Hanani put in prison, locked in stocks specifically, a form of detention designed to be not just restrictive but painful. This wasn't a gentle house arrest or a temporary holding cell. It was punitive imprisonment intended to punish the prophet for speaking uncomfortable truth. The man who brought God's word to the king was treated like a criminal for the crime of challenging royal decisions. The scriptures record that Asa was enraged with Hanani because of this. The Hebrew word suggests intense fury, the kind of anger that overwhelms judgment and produces impulsive cruelty. It wasn't merely that Asa disagreed with Hanani's assessment. He was infuriated that someone dared to question him at all. The king, who had once listened to spiritual counsel and acted on it, had become the kind of leader who punished anyone who challenged his choices. And it didn't stop with Hanani. The text tells us that at the same time, Asa brutally oppressed some of the people. The prophet's imprisonment created a climate of fear that extended beyond one individual. Others in the kingdom, perhaps those who had voiced agreement with Hanani, or simply failed to praise Asa's handling of the Baasha crisis enthusiastically enough, found themselves facing harsh treatment. The king who had once unified Judah through spiritual renewal was now ruling through intimidation. This is what makes Asa's story particularly tragic. He didn't become a tyrant overnight. There was no sudden transformation from faithful king to brutal dictator. Instead, there was a gradual drift, a slow erosion of the humility that had once characterized his leadership. Success had replaced dependence. Confidence had replaced trust. And when those shifts were pointed out by a prophet, pride prevented Asa from seeing what had happened to him. Think about the psychology of what occurred. Asa had spent decades building a successful kingdom. His reforms had worked. His leadership had brought prosperity. His careful administration had created stability. Every advisor around him likely confirmed that he was doing well. The people lived in peace. The enemies had been neutralized. By every visible measure, his kingship was succeeding. And then Hanani showed up and said, essentially, "You've forgotten what made you successful in the first place. You're trusting the wrong things." That's almost impossible for a powerful person to hear. When your entire identity is wrapped up in your competence, when your legacy is defined by your accomplishments, when your authority rests on your ability to make good decisions, having someone challenge the foundation of your thinking feels like an existential threat. Asa couldn't receive Hanani's correction without dismantling his entire self-understanding. He couldn't acknowledge that his diplomatic success was actually spiritual failure without questioning everything he had built. So he chose defense over introspection. He chose anger over humility. He chose to silence the messenger rather than examine the message, and in doing so he confirmed everything Hanani had said about the state of his heart. A king whose heart was fully committed to God would have paused, prayed, and considered whether the prophet might be right. A king who had drifted from that posture of dependence reacted with rage and repression. The tragedy deepened because Asa had the scriptural and experiential knowledge to know better. He had lived through the moment when he cried out to God against Zerah's army. He remembered the overwhelming relief when God delivered Judah from impossible odds. He had personally experienced the peace that comes from trusting God completely. But that memory had faded into the background of his consciousness, replaced by more recent memories of his own successful decision-making. The vivid experience of divine deliverance had been covered over by decades of human competence. This is the danger that success poses to faith. When things are going well, when our decisions seem to produce positive outcomes, when stability becomes normal, we gradually begin to believe that we are the source of our own security. The desperation that drove us to God in crisis fades. The awareness of our limitations diminishes. The gratitude that once overflowed becomes perfunctory. We don't consciously decide to stop trusting God. We simply develop parallel trust in our own wisdom and capabilities until, eventually, that becomes our primary reliance. And when someone points out this drift, we have a choice. We can receive it as the gift of correction, an opportunity to return to the foundation that once sustained us. Or we can reject it as an insult to our competence, a challenge to our authority that must be suppressed. Asa chose the second path, and in choosing it, he set the trajectory for the remainder of his reign. The imprisoned prophet sat in stocks, physically suffering for telling the truth. The oppressed citizens of Judah lived under increased fear, wondering if they might be next. And Asa continued ruling with the outward appearance of strength, while inwardly becoming more brittle, more defensive, more isolated from the very sources of wisdom that had once made him great. The man who had once removed idols from Judah had created a new idol, his own judgment, and he would defend that idol with whatever force necessary. Chapter 5. A King's Pride. The years following Hanani's imprisonment revealed the full extent of Asa's transformation. Where once he had been a reformer willing to challenge the status quo for the sake of faithfulness, he became a defender of his own decisions regardless of their spiritual implications. Where once he had sought God's guidance in times of crisis, he now relied exclusively on human wisdom and resources. The foundation had shifted, and the structure built upon it began to show cracks. The wars Hanani predicted materialized, not as dramatic invasions, but as the constant low-level conflicts that characterize kingdoms, trusting in political maneuvering rather than divine peace. Judah remained stable enough to avoid catastrophe, but the rest Asa had once known, the peace that came from seeking God wholeheartedly, was gone. In its place was the grinding work of maintaining alliances, managing regional tensions, and responding to threats through diplomatic and military means. But the most telling moment of Asa's later reign came not in war but in illness. In the 39th year of his rule, 3 years after imprisoning Hanani, Asa developed a disease in his feet. The condition was severe, debilitating enough that the chroniclers made specific note of it. Medical historians have speculated about what this might have been, gangrene perhaps, or some form of severe infection, or complications from gout. Whatever the specific diagnosis, it was serious enough to threaten Asa's life, and painful enough to dominate his final years. And here, in this moment of physical crisis, the pattern of Asa's spiritual drift reached its tragic conclusion. The text records with devastating simplicity. Though his disease was severe, even in his illness he did not seek help from the Lord, but only from the physicians. This single sentence captures everything about what Asa had become. It wasn't that seeking help from physicians was wrong. God has given human beings wisdom and skill in medicine, and there's nothing spiritually compromised about receiving medical treatment. But the word only reveals Asa's posture. He turned to human help exclusively, without any acknowledgement that God might be involved in healing, without any prayer for divine intervention, without any recognition that the great physician might have purposes beyond what human medicine could address. It was the same pattern that had characterized his response to Baasha's threat. When faced with a challenge, Asa looked to human solutions without considering divine options. When confronted with his own limitations, he trusted created things rather than the Creator. The man who once prayed, "Lord, there is no one like you to help the powerless against the mighty," now approached his own powerlessness without any thought of calling on that same Lord. The physicians did what they could. Ancient medicine had its limitations, lacking the antibiotics, surgical techniques and diagnostic tools that modern healthcare provides. They would have applied poultices, recommended dietary changes, perhaps attempted procedures that we would recognize as primitive. But they couldn't heal Asa. Whatever was wrong with his feet continued to worsen, and the king who had once stood strong before armies found himself increasingly unable to even stand physically. The chroniclers don't record whether Asa ever reflected on Hanani's words during those painful final years. We don't know if the king lying in bed with diseased feet ever thought about the prophet sitting in prison for telling him the truth. We don't know if he connected his physical suffering with his spiritual drift, if he saw his deteriorating health as an image of his deteriorating faith. The text simply records the facts: severe disease, no seeking of God, reliance only on physicians, and eventual death in the 41st year of his reign. Asa died without any recorded reconciliation with Hanani. There's no mention of the prophet being released from prison. There's no account of Asa repenting of his pride and returning to the posture of dependence that had once defined his early reign. The man who began so well, who reformed a nation and trusted God for impossible victory, ended his life having imprisoned the last prophet who dared to challenge his self-sufficiency. The funeral was elaborate. They laid Asa in a tomb he had cut out for himself in the city of David. They placed him on a bier covered with spices and various blended perfumes. They made a huge fire in his honour. The outward ceremonies celebrated a long reign and acknowledged his contributions to Judah's stability. But beneath the public honours was the private reality of a king who had forgotten where his true strength came from. His son Jehoshaphat succeeded him, and the chroniclers record that Jehoshaphat walked in the ways his father Asa had followed in his early years. Even Asa's own son recognised that there were two versions of King Asa, the faithful reformer of the beginning and the proud, defensive ruler of the end. The legacy was split, the reign remembered as both example and warning. Think about what might have been different if Asa had received Hanani's correction with humility. If instead of imprisoning the prophet he had listened. If instead of continuing in self-reliance he had returned to the faith that had once sustained him. If instead of trusting only in physicians during his illness, he had combined medical care with desperate prayer to the God who had once delivered him from Zerah's army. The trajectory of his final years could have been completely different, not necessarily in physical outcome, but certainly in spiritual legacy. But pride prevented that alternative story. Pride made correction feel like attack. Pride turned challenge into threat. Pride convinced Asa that defending his decisions mattered more than examining whether those decisions aligned with covenant faithfulness. And pride, in the end, left him isolated from both the human counsel that might have helped and the divine relationship that had once been his foundation. The man who had once told Judah to seek the Lord died without seeking the Lord himself. The king who had once relied on God for victory against overwhelming odds died relying exclusively on human help for healing. The leader who had reformed an entire nation's spiritual life died unreformed in his own heart. It was a tragedy not of sudden catastrophe, but of gradual drift, not of dramatic failure, but of quiet pride, not of external defeat, but of internal compromise. Chapter 6. Consequences over time. The story of Asa forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the nature of spiritual decline. We tend to think of falling away from faith as dramatic, as involving clear moral failures or explicit rejection of God. But Asa's drift was far more subtle. He never renounced the God of Israel. He never restored the idols he had removed. He never led Judah back into the pagan practices he had worked so hard to eliminate. By many measures, he remained a relatively faithful king throughout his reign. Yet something essential had changed. The posture of his heart had shifted from dependence to self-reliance. The orientation of his trust had moved from divine faithfulness to human wisdom. The source of his security had transferred from God's provision to his own competence. These internal shifts didn't produce immediate external consequences. Judah remained stable. The kingdom continued functioning. But underneath the surface, the foundation was slowly eroding. This is perhaps the most dangerous kind of spiritual decline because it's so easy to miss. When life is going well, when decisions are producing positive results, when stability feels secure, we don't recognize that our trust has migrated from God to our own capabilities. We still pray, still participate in worship, still affirm our faith, but the deep dependence that once characterized our relationship with God has been replaced by comfortable religious routine alongside practical self-sufficiency. Asa's later reign demonstrates how this plays out over time. The wars Hanani predicted weren't apocalyptic battles threatening Judah's existence. They were ongoing conflicts requiring constant attention, diplomatic maneuvering, and military readiness. Judah never collapsed, but it never returned to the rest that characterized Asa's early years either. Life became an endless management of regional tensions rather than a stable peace rooted in trust. The human cost of Asa's pride extended beyond his own spiritual condition. Hanani, imprisoned for speaking truth, represented every voice of correction that gets silenced when leaders value their authority over their accountability. The people Asa oppressed represented every person who suffers when power becomes more concerned with preserving itself than serving righteously. The son who succeeded him, Jehoshaphat, had to navigate the complex legacy of a father who was both example and warning. Yet even in this tragic trajectory, there's something important to note. Asa wasn't erased from redemptive history. His early faithfulness still mattered. His reform still had lasting impact. The removal of idols and restoration of worship didn't become meaningless because of his later failures. God's work, through him in those early years, remained real and significant. The story of Asa isn't that one set of failures negates a lifetime of faithfulness. It's that a lifetime of faithfulness can still end badly if we stop renewing the posture that made that faithfulness possible. The chroniclers recorded Asa's reign with neither complete condemnation nor unqualified praise. They acknowledged his strengths and documented his failures. They celebrated his early faithfulness and lamented his later pride. They preserved his story not to destroy his legacy, but to teach future generations about the ongoing nature of faith, about the danger of resting on past spiritual victories, about the necessity of continual dependence regardless of how stable life appears. The contrast between young Asa facing Zerah and old Asa facing illness crystallizes the entire narrative. The young king, overwhelmed by impossible odds, cried out to God in complete dependence. The old king, overwhelmed by disease, sought only human help. Both moments involved genuine powerlessness. Both situations exceeded Asa's ability to solve through his own strength. But in one, he recognized his limitations and turned to God. In the other, he trusted only in human capabilities despite having experienced divine deliverance decades earlier. What happened between those two moments? Success, stability, and the gradual accumulation of confidence in his own wisdom. Nothing dramatic, nothing sudden, just the slow drift that comes when we stop actively renewing our dependence on God. The memory of crying out in desperate faith faded, replaced by more recent memories of competent leadership and wise decision-making. The experiential knowledge of divine deliverance was covered over by decades of self-sufficient problem-solving. And when Hanani tried to point out this drift, to remind Asa of what he had forgotten, the king's response confirmed how far he had travelled from the humility of his early years. Instead of pausing to consider whether the prophet might be right, he reacted with defensive rage. Instead of examining his own heart, he imprisoned the messenger. Instead of using the correction as an opportunity to return to dependence, he doubled down on self-reliance. The physicians Asa consulted in his final illness likely did their best. They applied whatever knowledge and skill they possessed. They made recommendations and attempted treatments. But they couldn't address the deeper issue, the spiritual condition that left Asa seeking help exclusively from human sources without any acknowledgement of divine involvement. They could treat symptoms but not the root cause, a heart that had slowly turned away from the God who once delivered Judah from impossible odds. Asa died without any recorded moment of recognition, without any documented return to the faith of his early years, without any acknowledgement that Hanani had been right. The king who once led a nation back to covenant faithfulness couldn't quite make that journey himself when it mattered most, and so his story ends not with restoration but with warning, not with redemption but with the tragic consequences of pride unaddressed and correction rejected. Chapter 7. A Life Remembered. The legacy of Asa presents a complex picture that resists simple categorization. He wasn't a completely faithful king who made one terrible mistake, nor was he a secretly corrupt ruler whose early reforms were merely political theatre. He was something more recognizably human, a leader who began with genuine faith, achieved significant success through that faith, and then slowly came to trust his own wisdom more than the divine faithfulness that had initially sustained him. The biblical chroniclers preserved his story with remarkable honesty. They didn't sanitize his later failures to protect his reputation. They didn't exaggerate his early faithfulness to make the contrast more dramatic. They simply recorded both phases of his reign and allowed readers to draw their own conclusions about what happens when dependence gives way to self-reliance. In the genealogies of Judah's kings, Asa occupies an important place. He was the king who reversed the spiritual decline initiated by his predecessors. He removed the idols that had corrupted worship. He restored the covenant practices that defined Israel's relationship with God. He taught an entire generation what faithfulness looked like in practical terms, removing what shouldn't be there, rebuilding what had been neglected, and trusting God when circumstances seemed overwhelming. These contributions didn't evaporate because of his later pride. The idols he removed stayed gone. The worship practices he restored continued after his death. The spiritual foundation he rebuilt provided stability for his son's reign. God worked through Asa in those early years in ways that had lasting impact on Judah's history. The reforms were real, the faith was genuine, and the results were significant. But the ending of his story serves as a perpetual warning that beginning well doesn't guarantee finishing well, that early faithfulness doesn't exempt us from the ongoing work of maintaining dependence on God. That success can be more dangerous to faith than failure because it convinces us we're strong enough to handle things on our own. That the test of our trust often comes not in crisis but in comfort. Not when we're desperate but when we're confident. Subsequent generations in Judah would have known Asa's story in both its triumph and its tragedy. When they gathered for worship in the temple, they would remember that Asa had restored proper worship practices. When they saw the fortified cities throughout the kingdom, they would remember that Asa had built them during a time of peace secured through trusting God. When they recalled the defeat of Zerah's massive army, they would remember Asa's prayer acknowledging that only God could help the powerless against the mighty. But they would also remember Hanani. They would remember the prophet who spoke truth to power and suffered for it. They would remember the king who couldn't receive correction without rage. They would remember the lesson that imprisoning truth doesn't change truth, that silencing prophets doesn't validate the decisions they challenged, that defending our choices through force reveals the weakness of our position rather than its strength. The account of Asa appears in both 2 Chronicles and 1 Kings, with slight variations in emphasis but consistent in the basic narrative. Both accounts acknowledge his early faithfulness and document his later failures. Both record his successful military victory against Zerah and his problematic alliance with Ben-Hadad. Both note his reform efforts and his imprisonment of Hanani. The dual preservation of his story in Scripture suggests its importance as a teaching tool for understanding the ongoing nature of faith. For the people of Judah living under subsequent kings, Asa's reign provided categories for evaluating leadership. A king could be assessed not just by his policies, but by his posture toward God. The question wasn't merely whether idols were removed or enemies defeated, but whether the king maintained the posture of dependence that recognized God as the true source of security. A leader who began well but ended poorly taught something just as important as a leader who remained faithful throughout, that faith requires continual renewal, that trust must be consciously maintained, that dependence doesn't become automatic just because we once experienced it deeply. The chronicler's treatment of Asa also revealed something important about biblical historiography. They weren't engaged in propaganda designed to make every faithful king look perfect, or every unfaithful king look completely evil. They recorded reality with its complexities and contradictions, allowing human beings to appear human, acknowledging that the same person can make both wise and foolish decisions, can act from both faith and pride, can lead with both humility and arrogance depending on the circumstances and the condition of their heart. This honest accounting serves readers across millennia by validating our own complex experiences of faith. We don't have to pretend that spiritual life is simple or linear. We don't have to hide our struggles with pride or minimize our failures to trust God. We can acknowledge that faithfulness in one season doesn't guarantee faithfulness in the next, that we need God's grace not just at conversion, but continually, that the work of maintaining dependence is never complete while we live in this world. Asa's story also functions as a warning against the particular temptation of religious leaders and mature believers. People who have experienced significant spiritual victories, who have led others to faith, who have contributed to God's work in substantial ways face a unique danger. The very success of their faithfulness can become a source of pride that gradually replaces the dependence that made that faithfulness possible. The recognition of their spiritual maturity can convince them they've graduated beyond the need for correction. The respect of others can insulate them from the truth about their own hearts. When Hanani approached Asa, he wasn't confronting a flagrant sinner or an obvious hypocrite. He was addressing a king with a mostly successful reign, who had simply stopped trusting God as completely as he once had. The subtlety of Asa's drift is what makes the story so relevant. Most spiritual decline doesn't involve dramatic moral failures or explicit rejection of faith. It involves the gradual shift from "I need God desperately" to "I've got this figured out," that comes so naturally when life stabilizes and our competence increases. The lack of any recorded restoration in Asa's story leaves readers with an unsettling question. Could it have been different? If Asa had received Hanani's correction with humility, if he had recognized the truth in the prophet's words, if he had returned to the posture of dependence that characterized his early reign, would his final years have unfolded differently? We can't know for certain, but the question itself is important because it reminds us that we still have the opportunity to choose differently in our own lives. When correction comes, when someone points out that we've drifted from dependence to self-reliance, we can choose humility over pride, introspection over defense, return over resistance. Asa's life remembered is ultimately a call to vigilance, not the anxious vigilance that questions every decision or the scrupulous vigilance that becomes paralyzed by fear of failure, but the honest vigilance that regularly asks, where am I actually trusting? What am I really depending on? Has my success convinced me I'm strong enough to handle life without God's constant provision? Have I stopped crying out in prayer because I've become confident in my own wisdom? Do I react defensively when someone suggests I might be drifting? These questions matter because the trajectory of faith isn't determined by a single moment, but by the cumulative effect of thousands of small choices about where we place our trust. Asa made good choices early and poor choices late, not because he changed religions or abandoned morality, but because he slowly stopped choosing dependence over self-reliance. His story stands as evidence that the work of faith is never done, that trust must be renewed continually, that the posture of our hearts requires constant attention, regardless of how long we've walked with God or how much we've accomplished in his service. Epilogue: Eyes that search the earth. Hanani's words to Asa have echoed across centuries. The eyes of the Lord range throughout the earth to strengthen those whose hearts are fully committed to him. It's one of those biblical statements that sounds comforting at first but becomes more challenging the longer you sit with it. God isn't primarily looking for talented people, though he can use talent. He isn't primarily looking for competent people, though competence has its place. He isn't primarily looking for successful people, though success rightly understood is fine. God is looking for people whose hearts are fully committed to him, people who maintain the posture of dependence regardless of their circumstances, people who trust him in prosperity as completely as they trusted him in desperation. This isn't about perfection. Asa's early reign wasn't flawless. He made mistakes, faced challenges, navigated complex situations. But his heart was oriented toward God, and that orientation made all the difference. When overwhelming odds threatened Judah, Asa's response revealed where his trust actually resided. Lord, there is no one like you to help the powerless against the mighty. That's the kind of heart God searches for and strengthens. The tragedy of Asa's story is that he once had exactly this kind of heart. He experienced God's strengthening in dramatic fashion. He knew what it meant to trust completely and see God prove faithful. But that experiential knowledge gradually faded into the background as years passed and success accumulated. The heart that was once fully committed became partially committed, divided between trusting God and trusting human resources, split between dependence and self-reliance. And when that division was pointed out by Hanani, when Asa had the opportunity to recognize his drift and return to full commitment, pride prevented it. The king whose heart God had once strengthened became the king whose heart resisted correction. The leader who had taught others to trust God became the example of what happens when trust erodes over time. But the principle Hanani articulated remains true, regardless of Asa's failure to live it out. God's eyes still range throughout the earth. He still searches for hearts fully committed to him. He still strengthens those who maintain the posture of dependence. The failure of one king doesn't invalidate the spiritual reality. If anything, Asa's story makes the principle more urgent by showing what's at stake when we drift from it. Consider what full commitment actually means in practical terms. It doesn't mean never using human wisdom or resources. Asa wasn't wrong to fortify cities or organise the military. It doesn't mean being passive or inactive. Asa's reforms required tremendous effort and courage. It doesn't mean pretending we don't have capabilities or gifts. Asa was clearly an intelligent and capable leader. Full commitment means that underneath all our planning, strategizing and effort, our fundamental trust rests in God rather than in ourselves. It means that when we face challenges exceeding our natural abilities, our first response is to seek divine help rather than exclusively pursuing human solutions. It means that when we achieve success, we recognize God's provision rather than crediting only our own competence. It means that when someone points out we're drifting from this posture, we receive it as correction rather than attack. Asa's early prayer against Zerah perfectly captured this balance. He didn't pray instead of organizing his army. He organized his army and prayed. He didn't deny that military strategy mattered. He acknowledged that no strategy could overcome the odds without divine intervention. He combined human responsibility with divine dependence in a way that honoured both. That's what full commitment looks like in action. The contrast with his later response to Baasha's threat couldn't be sharper. When faced with a less overwhelming challenge, Asa relied entirely on human diplomacy without seeking God at all. He used resources dedicated to God to buy a military alliance without praying about whether this aligned with divine purposes. He solved the immediate problem while creating long-term consequences. That's what partial commitment looks like. Effective in the short term, but disconnected from the source of lasting peace. For those of us reading Asa's story millennia later, the application is uncomfortably direct. We live in an era that celebrates self-reliance and prizes competence. We're taught to trust data, to make strategic plans, to leverage resources effectively. These aren't wrong in themselves, but they become dangerous when they replace rather than supplement dependence on God. When our first instinct in crisis is to Google solutions rather than pray. When our security rests in savings accounts rather than divine provision. When our confidence comes from our abilities rather than God's faithfulness. The challenge is that this drift happens so gradually we don't notice it. We don't consciously decide to stop trusting God. We just slowly develop parallel trust in our own capabilities until that becomes primary. We still pray, still attend, worship, still affirm our faith. But the desperate dependence that once characterized our relationship with God has been replaced by comfortable religious routine alongside practical self-sufficiency. We become functional atheists who maintain religious language but operate as if outcomes depend entirely on us. Hanani's confrontation of Asa offers a template for how to address this drift, both in our own lives and when we see it in others. The prophet didn't attack Asa's character or question his faith. He simply reminded the king of what he already knew, that he once trusted God completely and God proved faithful. He held up the past as a mirror to examine the present. He asked, essentially, what changed? Not God's ability to deliver. So what changed in you? That's the question we all need to sit with regularly. What has changed in me? When did I stop crying out to God in prayer and start relying primarily on my own wisdom? When did success convince me I was strong enough to handle things independently? When did stability lead me to forget how desperately I need divine provision? These aren't comfortable questions, but they're necessary for maintaining the kind of full commitment God searches for. The ongoing nature of this work can't be overstated. Faith isn't proven once and then finished. Trust isn't established in one dramatic moment and then maintained automatically. Dependence doesn't become our default setting just because we experienced it deeply in the past. The posture of our hearts requires continual attention, regular examination, and frequent renewal. We can't coast on yesterday's faithfulness. We can't rely on past spiritual victories to sustain present trust. We have to choose dependence repeatedly, in circumstances big and small, throughout all the seasons of our lives. Asa's story ends with his death and burial, but the principles it teaches continue to live. Somewhere in Judah, after his death, another person faced a crisis and had to decide whether to trust God or human solutions. Another leader navigated the tension between competent planning and desperate prayer. Another believer wrestled with the slow drift from dependence to self-reliance. Asa's story informed those decisions by providing both example and warning, both inspiration and caution. And the same remains true today. The eyes of the Lord still range throughout the earth. God still searches for hearts fully committed to him. He still strengthens those who maintain dependence regardless of their circumstances. The question isn't whether this principle works, but whether we'll live in alignment with it. Whether we'll be like young Asa crying out in faith, or old Asa trusting only in human help. Whether we'll receive correction with humility or reject it with pride. Whether we'll finish our lives with hearts fully committed, or with the tragic division that comes from gradual drift. The God who delivered Judah from Zerah's overwhelming army hasn't changed. The divine faithfulness that sustained Asa's early reign remains constant. The offer of strength for those whose hearts are fully committed still stands. What changes is us, our trust, our dependence, our willingness to acknowledge that we desperately need God regardless of how capable we've become or how stable our circumstances appear. Hanani delivered his message and faced imprisonment. Asa rejected correction and faced ongoing conflict. But the truth Hanani spoke didn't depend on Asa's reception. God's eyes still range throughout the earth, and tonight, right now, wherever you are in your own journey of faith, that same God is searching for hearts fully committed to him, ready to strengthen anyone willing to maintain the posture of trust that Asa once knew, but ultimately abandoned. The story doesn't end with answers to every question. We don't know what finally happened to Hanani. We don't know if Asa ever regretted his response. We don't know how different his final years might have been if he had chosen humility over pride. But we do know this. Faith must be renewed continually. Trust can't rest on past victories. Dependence requires ongoing choice. And the God who once strengthened a king, who cried out in desperate faith, still searches for hearts positioned to receive that same strengthening today. That's the legacy of Asa's mixed reign. The warning from his later failures, the hope from his early faithfulness, and the ongoing invitation embedded in Hanani's words. The eyes of the Lord are still searching. The question is whether our hearts remain fully committed or whether, like Asa, we've slowly drifted into trusting our own strength while maintaining the language of faith. It's a question worth sitting with, because how we answer it shapes not just our immediate circumstances, but the entire trajectory of our lives and the legacy we leave behind. There is a place in the ancient world where the wind carries the scent of cedar and jasmine through corridors of polished stone, where lamplight bends against gold-threaded curtains, and the footsteps of servants echo through halls wide enough to swallow the memory of entire nations. This is the Persian Empire at the height of its power, and it stretches from the warm shores of the Aegean Sea to the sun-baked plateaus of India, encompassing 127 provinces and millions of souls who wake each morning beneath the long shadow of a single throne. The empire is not merely large, it is a world unto itself, a civilization built on ceremony and hierarchy, on the careful arrangement of power and the quiet terror of those who live beneath it. At the centre of this vast machine of governance and military might sit a king named Xerxes, known in the ancient Hebrew texts as Ahasuerus, a man whose word is law and whose moods shape the fortunes of empires. He is not a gentle king. He is not a philosopher king who sits in quiet reflection considering the weight of his decisions. He is a king who feasts, who commands, who expects obedience the way the mountains expect silence. And in the 3rd year of his reign, in the royal city of Susa, he throws a party. It is not a party in any sense that the modern world would recognize as modest. This is a celebration that lasts 180 days, a feast that stretches across half a year, during which the king displays the wealth of his kingdom and the glory of his greatness to every prince and official and military commander in his domain. The palace gardens are transformed into something almost dreamlike, hung with white and violet linen curtains fastened to silver rods with cords of fine linen and purple. The couches are gold and silver, set upon a mosaic floor of porphyry and marble and mother of pearl. Wine flows from golden vessels, each one different from the last, and the royal wine is abundant because the king has commanded it. It is excess made architecture. It is power made edible. And for 6 months, the great men of Persia eat and drink in the shadow of the king's magnificence, and they understand, without being told, what it means to live beneath such authority. When the great feast ends, the king throws another, smaller celebration for all the people in the citadel of Susa, from the greatest to the least. 7 days of additional feasting because the first 180 apparently did not suffice. And on the 7th day of this second celebration, when the king's heart is merry with wine, a thought occurs to him. He wants to show off his wife. Queen Vashti is by all accounts a woman of extraordinary beauty, and the king, flushed with wine and pride and the accumulated pleasure of months of being celebrated, sends his 7 chamberlains to bring her before the assembled guests wearing her royal crown. He wants them to see her. He wants the princes and the nobles to understand that even his queen, the most beautiful woman in the empire, belongs to the tableau of his greatness. She is, in his mind in this moment, another treasure to be displayed alongside the golden vessels and the marble floors and the violet curtains. Vashti refuses. It is one of the most startling moments in all of ancient literature, this quiet, firm refusal from a woman who has every reason in the world to simply comply. We're not given her reasons. The text does not explain her thinking or record her words. It simply tells us that she refused, and this refusal lands in the king's court like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of consequence outward in every direction. The king is furious. His rage burns within him, and he turns to his wise men, the 7 princes of Persia and Media, who have access to the king and rank highest in the kingdom, and he asks them what the law demands should be done to Queen Vashti for failing to obey the king's command. The wise men, being wise in the particular way of men who wish to preserve their own power, recognize immediately that this is not simply a domestic dispute. This is a political crisis. If word spreads throughout the empire that Queen Vashti refused the king's command and suffered no consequence, they argue, then every wife in the empire will feel emboldened to show contempt for her husband. The nobles of Persia and Media will hear of what the queen has done, and there will be contempt and anger enough to fill 100 provinces. The solution, they say, is clear. Let a royal decree go out from the king, written in the laws of Persia and Media so that it cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before King Xerxes, and let the king give her royal position to someone better than she. When this decree is proclaimed throughout the vast empire, all women will honour their husbands, from the greatest to the least. And so it is written. And so it is sealed. And so Queen Vashti, who refused to be displayed like a piece of furniture, disappears from the story, removed from her position by the fear of powerful men who worried what her example might inspire in others. She walks out of the historical record with her dignity intact and her crown surrendered, and the empire turns its attention to finding her replacement. The king's attendants, once his anger has subsided and he has had time to sit with the strangeness of what has happened, suggest a course of action. Let beautiful young virgins be sought throughout the provinces of the empire. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province to gather all beautiful young women to the harem in Susa, to the care of Hegai, the king's eunuch who is in charge of the women. Let them receive beauty treatments for 12 months, and then let the young woman who pleases the king be made queen in Vashti's place. The king agrees, the decree goes out, and from every corner of that vast empire, young women begin the long journey to the palace in Susa. Among them, arriving without fanfare, without political connections, without any of the advantages that the daughters of nobles and merchants might carry with them, is a young Jewish woman named Esther. Her Hebrew name is Hadassah, which means myrtle, but she is known as Esther, a name that may derive from a Persian word meaning star, or perhaps from the name of the Babylonian goddess Ishtar. She is an orphan, her mother and father both dead, and she has been raised by her cousin Mordecai, a man of the tribe of Benjamin whose family was among those carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar. Mordecai works at the king's gate, one of the countless officials who fill the lower ranks of the imperial bureaucracy, and he has raised Esther as his own daughter with a care and attentiveness that speaks of genuine love. When the king's decree goes out, Esther is gathered with the other young women and brought to the palace, and before she enters those gates, Mordecai gives her a single instruction: quiet and grave. She is not to reveal her people or her kindred. She is not to tell anyone that she is Jewish. This is not, in the context of the Persian Empire, a strange request. The Jews are a minority population living in exile, their temple destroyed, their city of Jerusalem a ruin, their national identity something they carry internally rather than display publicly. For Esther to identify herself as Jewish would be to invite a different kind of scrutiny, a different kind of treatment, and so she keeps the secret. She enters the palace as simply a beautiful young woman, one among many, carrying her true identity inside herself like a lamp kept lit beneath a covering. What happens next is remarkable in its understated quality. Esther enters the care of Hegai, the king's eunuch in charge of the women, and she finds favour in his sight. He is pleased with her. He quickly provides her with beauty treatments and food and 7 chosen young women to attend her, and he moves her and her attendants to the best place in the harem. There is something happening here beneath the surface of the text, something that the careful reader notices. It is not merely that Esther is beautiful, though she clearly is. It is that she is somehow exactly the right kind of person for whatever space she enters. She finds favour everywhere she goes. The word favour appears again and again in connection with Esther, and it carries the weight of something more than mere personal charm. It carries the sense that doors are opening for her that might remain closed for others, that there is some hand other than coincidence guiding these small moments of goodwill. Mordecai, for his part, does not disappear. Every single day he walks in front of the court of the harem, learning how Esther is and how she fares. He's not a man who releases what he loves carelessly. He keeps vigil from whatever distance is permitted to him, faithful and watchful, while inside the palace walls his cousin learns the customs of the court and undergoes the year-long beauty treatments required of every young woman before she can appear before the king. The process is elaborate and lengthy, a full 12 months of preparation, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and ointments for women. Each young woman comes to the king in the evening and returns in the morning to the second harem, in the custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch in charge of the concubines, and she does not come to the king again unless the king delights in her and she's called by name. For most of these young women, this single night determines their entire future. Those who do not please the king well enough to be chosen as queen are simply absorbed into the secondary harem, living out their days in a kind of comfortable captivity, neither wives nor free women, belonging to the palace and to no other life. When Esther's turn comes, she asks for nothing beyond what Haggai the eunuch advises. She does not pile herself with jewellery and perfume and elaborate costuming the way some of the others might. She trusts the judgment of the man who has watched the king's preferences over years of service, who knows better than anyone what quality of simplicity or what kind of presence will resonate in that throne room. And when she comes before the king loves her more than all the women, and she wins grace and favour in his sight more than all the virgins. He places the royal crown on her head and makes her queen instead of Vashti. The king holds a great feast in Esther's honour, giving grants to the provinces and giving gifts with royal generosity. Esther is queen. She lives in the palace with all its beauty and danger and political complexity, carrying her secret Jewish identity inside her, the way you carry a flame against the wind, both concealing it and guarding it. And Mordecai continues to sit at the king's gate, keeping his vigil, watching the story unfold. It is while he is sitting there at the gate that Mordecai overhears something important. Two of the king's officials, Bigthan and Teresh, who guarded the threshold of the palace, have grown angry with the king and are planning to assassinate him. Mordecai learns of this plot and tells Queen Esther, and Esther tells the king in Mordecai's name. The matter is investigated, found to be true, and the two men are hanged on the gallows. And then this detail, this act of loyalty and service that saved the king's life, is recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the king's presence. It is recorded, written down, filed away, and then apparently nothing happens. Mordecai receives no reward, no promotion, no recognition. The king does not call him forward and give him land or gold or an elevated position. The account is simply noted, and life at the palace continues. This is where the story, which has so far been a tale of court politics and personal fortune, begins to turn towards something darker. After these things, the text says, King Xerxes promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. Haman becomes the second most powerful man in the empire, elevated above all other nobles and servants of the king, and the king commands that all the royal officials at the king's gate are to bow down and pay homage to Haman. This is not merely a matter of professional courtesy. This is a formal act of submission, a public acknowledgement of Haman's power and authority, required by royal decree. Mordecai will not bow. Day after day, the other officials at the king's gate bow when Haman passes. Day after day, Mordecai remains standing. The officials begin to notice. They ask him why he transgresses the king's command. He does not give them a full explanation, but he tells them that he is a Jew. Whether his refusal is rooted in religious conviction, in the ancient enmity between the tribe of Benjamin and the Agagites, in personal pride, or in some combination of these things, the text does not entirely clarify. What is clear is that he will not bow, and the officials tell Haman to see whether Mordecai's words will stand, for he has told them that he is a Jew. When Haman sees for himself that Mordecai does not bow down or pay homage to him, he is filled with fury. But he has also been told that Mordecai is a Jew, and this information, combined with his rage, produces something monstrous in his thinking. It is not enough for him to destroy Mordecai alone, the text says. He has been told what people Mordecai belongs to, and he disdains to lay hands on Mordecai alone. He decides to destroy all the Jews throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes, all the people of Mordecai's kind. His personal wounded pride metastasizes into something genocidal. To determine the perfect date for this destruction, Haman casts lots, the ancient method of divination that gives the book its name. The word for lots in Hebrew is Purim, and in the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, Haman casts pur after pur to determine the most favourable date for his plan. The lot falls on the 12th month, the month of Adar. Haman has nearly a year to wait and a year to plan. He goes to the king with a carefully constructed argument. There is a certain people, he says, scattered and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of the kingdom, whose laws are different from those of every other people, and who do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not appropriate for the king to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and Haman will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, to be brought into the king's treasuries. The king, seemingly unbothered by the specifics of who these people are or what they have actually done, removes his signet ring from his hand and gives it to Haman. The money, he says, is given to you, and the people also, to do with them as it seems good to you. The decree is written by Haman's scribes in the name of King Xerxes, and sealed with the king's signet ring. It is sent to all the king's satraps and governors and officials of every province, to every people in their own language. The letters command that all Jews, young and old, women and children, be destroyed, killed, and annihilated in a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and their possessions be plundered. Couriers go out swiftly by order of the king, and the decree is issued in Susa the citadel. And then, in one of the most chilling details in all of ancient literature, the text simply notes that the king and Haman sat down to drink, while the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. Two men sit with their wine while an empire processes the information that an entire people has been scheduled for extermination. The contrast is almost too stark to bear. While Haman and the king drink, Jewish communities throughout 127 provinces are reading the decree, understanding what it means, beginning to mourn. And in Susa itself, Mordecai tears his clothes and puts on sackcloth and ashes, and goes out into the middle of the city, wailing with a loud and bitter cry. Throughout all the provinces where the king's command and his decree reach, there is great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and many of them lie in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's young women and her eunuchs come and tell her what is happening, she is deeply distressed. She sends garments to Mordecai to clothe him, to replace the sackcloth, but Mordecai does not accept them. She sends one of the king's eunuchs, Hathach, to learn what is happening and why. And Mordecai tells Hathach everything that has happened, and gives him a copy of the text of the decree that was issued in Susa for the Jews' destruction, so that Hathach can show it to Esther and explain it to her, and charge her to go to the king and beg his favour and plead with him on behalf of her people. When Esther receives this message, her response is honest and frightened and deeply human. She sends Hathach back to Mordecai with her answer. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden sceptre, so that he may live. And she has not been called to come into the king for 30 days. This is the reality of her life. She is the queen of the most powerful empire in the known world, and she cannot simply walk into the throne room and speak to her husband. The protocol is absolute. To approach the king uninvited is to risk death. The golden sceptre extended toward you is mercy. The golden sceptre withheld is execution. And Esther has not been summoned for a month. She does not know if the king is pleased with her. She does not know how she stands in his favour. She is explaining to Mordecai and perhaps also to herself why what he is asking is extraordinarily dangerous. Mordecai's response, delivered through Hathach back to Esther, is one of the most memorable passages in all of Scripture. Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? This is not simply a challenge. It is a theological statement and a practical argument simultaneously. Mordecai is telling Esther that her position does not protect her. If she thinks that being queen means she will be exempted from the coming destruction, she is wrong. The decree names all Jews without exception. And then he makes the deeper point. the one that has echoed through centuries of commentary and reflection. Who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? All of it, he is suggesting. The death of her parents, the exile of her people, her remarkable beauty, the strange chain of events that led a Jewish orphan girl to become the Queen of Persia, the favour she found with Hegai, the love she inspired in the king, all of it may have been moving toward this single moment. The timing is not accidental. The positioning is not coincidence. And if she does not act, she will lose everything anyway, but the door of opportunity will have closed without her having walked through it. Esther takes this in, and then she sends her answer back to Mordecai, and the person who answers is different from the one who first received his message. She's no longer explaining why she cannot. She's organising how she will. Go, she says, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. The phrase lands with the quiet force of a door closing and another opening. If I perish, I perish. It is not bravado. It is not the theatrical courage of someone who believes they will certainly survive. It is the acknowledgement that the outcome is genuinely uncertain, and the decision to act anyway. She has counted the cost, considered the danger, weighed her position against the lives of her people, and she has chosen. Mordecai goes away and does everything that Esther has commanded him. For 3 days the Jewish community in Susa fasts. Esther and her attendants fast in the palace. There is no food, no water, no ordinary rhythm of daily life. There is only the directed intensity of people who believe that prayer and fasting can reach beyond the walls of a palace, beyond the protocols of an empire, into whatever realm of power and purpose stands above and behind the visible world. They are asking for something they cannot arrange themselves. They are preparing for a confrontation with earthly power by seeking connection with something higher. On the 3rd day, Esther puts on her royal robes. This is not the act of someone who has given up on beauty or protocol. This is a deliberate choice, an understanding that she must appear before the king not as a petitioner in mourning clothes, but as a queen, as someone who belongs in that space. She dresses herself in everything she is, and she walks to the inner court of the king's palace, opposite the king's hall. The king is sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. When the king sees Queen Esther standing in the court, she wins favour in his sight. He holds out to her the golden sceptre that is in his hand. Esther approaches and touches the tip of the sceptre, and the king says to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given you, even to the half of my kingdom." She survived the approach. The sceptre is extended, and now she must speak. But Esther does not immediately reveal her purpose. A person expecting her to simply pour out the whole story of the decree, and Haman and the Jewish people might be surprised by her response. "If it pleases the king," she says, "let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I have prepared for the king." She invites them to a banquet, just the king and Haman and the queen. A dinner. The king immediately sends for Haman, and they come to the feast that Esther has prepared. And as they are drinking wine after the feast, the king again asks Esther what her petition is, saying that it shall be granted to her even to half his kingdom. And again, Esther does not yet reveal the full weight of what she carries. "My petition and my request," she says, "is if I have found favour in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfil my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast that I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said." She's inviting them to a second banquet, 2 dinners, 2 opportunities to build the context, to ensure the king is comfortable and open and favourably disposed, before she reveals what she actually needs. This is not weakness or procrastination. This is strategy. Esther understands the man she's dealing with and the environment she's operating in, and she's creating the best possible conditions for what must be the most important conversation of her life. Haman goes out that day joyful and glad of heart. He's been invited to dine privately with the king and queen. Twice. This is, in his understanding, the pinnacle of his social achievement, the confirmation that he stands above all others in the king's favour. He goes home, calls for his friends and his wife Zeresh, and tells them all about his riches and his many children, and all the promotions with which the king has honoured him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and servants of the king. He's at the height of his power as he sees it, and he needs them to see it too. Then he adds, and this is the detail that reveals everything about his psychology, that even Queen Esther let no one but himself come with the king to the feast she prepared, and tomorrow also he is invited by her together with the king. Yet, he says, all this is worth nothing to me, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. He cannot enjoy it. All the wealth, all the honour, all the private dinners with royalty, all of it is poisoned by the fact that one man, a minor official at the city gate, will not bow to him. His wife and friends have a simple suggestion. Let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go joyfully with the king to the feast. This suggestion pleases Haman, and he has the gallows built. That night, the king cannot sleep. It is one of those simple details that changes everything. An emperor in his palace, the most powerful man in the world, lying awake in the dark with his thoughts. He commands that the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, be brought and read to him. And in those Chronicles, the reader being unable to sleep finds the account of Mordecai telling about Bigthan and Teresh, those two officials who had sought to assassinate King Xerxes. The king asks what honour or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this, and his servants tell him that nothing has been done for him. Nothing. The man who saved the king's life was recorded in the Chronicles and then forgotten. He received no reward, no recognition, nothing. And now, years later, because a king could not sleep, because a record keeper chose this particular passage, because the chronicle happened to fall open at exactly this account, the king is suddenly, belatedly, aware of the debt, and Haman has just arrived in the outer court of the king's palace to tell the king to have Mordecai hanged on the gallows he has just built. The king's servants tell him Haman is there, and he says to bring him in. Haman enters, and before Haman can say anything, the king poses a question. What should be done to the man whom the king delights to honour? Haman, whose entire mental world at this moment revolves around himself and his grievances and his enemy, thinks to himself that the king delights to honour no one more than Haman himself. So he suggests a ritual of royal honour beyond anything previously described. Let the royal robes be brought, the robes that the king has worn, and the horse that the king has ridden and on whose head a royal crown is set. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials, and let them dress the man whom the king delights to honour, and let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honour." The king says, quickly, "Take the robes and the horse as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned." The devastation of this moment for Haman must have been total. He came to ask for Mordecai's execution. He is leaving to personally lead Mordecai through the city square on the king's own horse, proclaiming his honour before the crowd. He takes the robes and the horse and dresses Mordecai and leads him through the square of the city, proclaiming as the king commanded. Then Mordecai returns to the king's gate, and Haman hurries to his house, mourning and with his head covered. He tells his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that has happened to him, and his wise men and Zeresh's wife say to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him." This is a stunning acknowledgement from Haman's own household, from the people who urged him to build the gallows. There is a recognition here of something larger than politics, a sense that what is unfolding cannot be stopped by the instruments of imperial power. While they are still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrive and hurry Haman to the feast that Esther has prepared. The second banquet. The king and Haman recline at the table with Queen Esther, and after the wine has been served, the king again asks, "What is your petition, Queen Esther?" it shall be granted you, and what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled. This is the moment. Everything has been leading here. 3 days of fasting, the careful strategy of the first dinner, the sleepless night of the king, the public humiliation of Haman, and now Esther sits at a table with both her husband and her people's would-be destroyer, and the king is asking her what she wants. If I have found favour in your sight, O king, she begins, and if it pleases the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. But we are to be wiped out. The king does not immediately understand. He asks who has done this, who has dared to fill his heart with such presumption. And Esther says, a foe, an enemy, this wicked Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. The king, in his rage, rises from the feast and goes into the palace garden. Haman, realizing that disaster has been determined against him by the king, stays to beg for his life from Queen Esther. He is so desperate that when the king returns from the palace garden and finds Haman has fallen on the couch where Esther is, the king misreads the scene entirely, perhaps willfully. Will he even assault the queen in my own house? The word goes out from the king's mouth, and the servants cover Haman's face. One of the king's eunuchs, Harbona, mentions as if in passing that the gallows 50 cubits high stands at Haman's house, which Haman prepared for Mordecai, who had saved the king. The king says, hang him on that. And they hang Haman on the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's anger abated. It is almost impossible not to notice what has happened here. The instrument of death that Haman constructed specifically for Mordecai becomes the instrument of his own death. He built it, named it, designated it, positioned it in his own yard and died on it. The reversal is complete, precise, and carries the quality of something that was arranged at a level beyond human planning. But the story is not finished, because the decree is still in force. Persian law, once written and sealed with the king's ring, cannot be revoked. The edict calling for the destruction of all Jews throughout the empire still stands. Haman is dead, but his legacy threatens to outlast him. The day set for the annihilation is still coming, written in stone by the laws of Persia and Media. Esther goes to the king again, this time falling at his feet and weeping and begging him to avert the evil plan of Haman the Agagite and the plot that he had devised against the Jews. The king extends the golden scepter to Esther again, and she rises and stands before him. She makes her plea eloquently and specifically. If it pleases the king, and if he regards her with favour, and the thing seems right before the king, and she is pleasing in his eyes, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman the Agagite. The king's answer reflects the nature of Persian law. He cannot revoke the decree. What is written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked. But he can write another decree, a new edict that allows the Jews to defend themselves, to gather and protect themselves, and to destroy the power of any armed force that might attack them. He gives his ring to Esther and Mordecai writes letters in the king's name and seals them with the king's signet ring, sending them by mounted couriers on swift horses bred from the royal stud. The letters give the Jews in every city the right to gather and defend their lives, to destroy and kill and annihilate any armed force that might attack them, to plunder their goods. When Mordecai goes out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a great golden crown and a robe of fine linen and purple, the city of Susa shouts and rejoices, and for the Jews there is light and gladness and joy and honour. In every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there is gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. The appointed day comes, the 13th day of the 12th month. Throughout the empire, Jews gather and defend themselves. Those who had planned to profit from the decree against the Jews find themselves facing communities that are prepared, authorized, and fighting for their lives. The enemies of the Jews are defeated. Haman's 10 sons, who had carried forward their father's work, are killed, and on the 14th day the Jews rest and make it a day of feasting and joy. Esther sends letters to all the Jews establishing that they should keep annually the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar as days when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness and from mourning into a holiday. They are to make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another and gifts to the poor. This is the festival of Purim, which takes its name from the lots that Haman cast to determine the date of the Jews' destruction. The instrument of their intended annihilation becomes the name of their annual celebration. The feast is established and observed to this day, a permanent marker in the Jewish calendar of the moment when a death sentence became a deliverance. Mordecai the Jew is second in rank to King Xerxes and is great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brothers, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all his people. Esther remains queen, the Jewish people survive, and the particular shape of how it all happened, the timing, the sleepless night, the chronicle that happened to be read aloud, the gallows that Haman built for someone else, the sceptre extended rather than withheld, all of it is now part of the record. What is perhaps most striking about the Book of Esther, and what has generated centuries of theological discussion, is that the name of God does not appear anywhere in it. Not once. This is unique in the Hebrew Bible. Every other book invokes the divine name, calls on the Lord, records direct communication between the human and the holy. The Book of Esther is different. God is not mentioned. There are no miracles in the conventional sense, no burning bushes, no parting seas, no voices from the clouds. There is instead a series of events that, taken individually, might each be explained as coincidence or politics or human nature, but taken together, following as they do a particular shape and moving toward a particular conclusion, they carry the unmistakable weight of design. This is in fact one of the most sophisticated theological arguments in the entire biblical canon. The Book of Esther does not show you God. It shows you what a world looks like when God is working in it through ordinary means, through human decisions and royal protocols, and the inability of a king to sleep, and the willingness of a young woman to take an impossible risk. It says something profound about the nature of divine action in a world that does not always announce itself as sacred. It says that the fingerprints may be everywhere even when the hand is invisible. Esther herself is a figure of extraordinary complexity. She's not a prophet. She does not receive divine revelations or angelic visitors. She begins the story as a young woman who has been carefully sheltered and instructed to conceal her identity. And she moves through the narrative navigating the complicated politics of a foreign court with a combination of natural grace and deliberate strategy. She obeys Mordecai because she trusts him. She approaches the king because she has been convinced that she has no real alternative. She chooses her timing carefully, inviting her enemies to dinner not once but twice before revealing her hand. And yet, for all this political calculation, there is a moment in her story that transcends strategy. It is the 3 days of fasting before she approaches the king. Whatever else the fast represents, it represents an acknowledgement that she cannot do this on her own. She's asking for help from whatever power exists beyond her own cleverness and beauty and position. And when she emerges from those 3 days and puts on her royal robes and walks to the inner court, she's not just a queen approaching her king. She's a person who has done everything she can do and then trusted the rest to something beyond herself. The question that Mordecai asks her, whether she has come to the kingdom for such a time as this, is not merely a question about one woman's purpose. It is a question about the relationship between individual lives and larger narratives. It suggests that the details of a person's life, including the painful ones, including the orphaning and the exile, and the hiding of her true identity, may be preparation for something that only becomes visible in retrospect. The parents she lost, the people from whom she was separated, the years of keeping a secret, none of these things felt like preparation at the time, they felt like loss. But in the moment when her position and her courage and her people's need all converge. Every detail of her history becomes relevant. This is a pattern that appears throughout human experience. The way that things that seemed merely unfortunate or inexplicable later reveal themselves to have been necessary. The path that seemed like a detour was the road. The delay that felt like abandonment was timing. The weakness that seemed disqualifying was the precise thing that created the empathy needed for the work. Esther's story does not suggest that suffering is good or that loss is simple. It suggests that nothing is necessarily wasted, that the accumulation of a life, even a difficult one, may be moving towards something that requires every part of it. Haman represents something that also appears throughout human experience, the way that wounded pride, when it is given power, becomes capable of enormous destruction. He is not presented as someone who began with genocidal intentions. He is presented as a man who received an honour that he believed entitled him to universal deference, and who encountered one person who would not give it. And from that single refusal, from the inability of one minor official at the city gate to bow, Haman extrapolated an entire people's unworthiness to live. The logic of wounded pride is always like this. It cannot rest with the individual who offended it. It has to explain the offence as something structural, something that reflects a category of people rather than a particular person's choice. If it were just about Mordecai, Haman might have found a way to have him quietly removed. But because it is about Haman's own sense of entitlement and significance, it has to become about something bigger. And yet, for all his power, for all the king's ring and the sealed decree and the gallows he built, Haman falls in the precise shape of his own design. He is destroyed by the mechanism he created. The gallows for Mordecai receives Haman. The decree for the Jews' destruction becomes the context for a counter-decree that defeats his forces. His name, which he sought to elevate above all others, survives in the historical record specifically as the name of a villain. The thing he most wanted to be permanently honoured is achieved only in permanent infamy. Mordecai, by contrast, is a man whose patience is almost inhuman in its quality. He raises an orphan with care and attention. He sits at the city gate day after day, keeping watch over a young woman who has entered a world where he cannot follow her. He refuses to bow to a man whose title would seem to demand it, not in defiance for its own sake, but out of a fidelity to something he considers more fundamental. He communicates with Esther through intermediaries, sending messages through the walls of a palace, and when the crisis comes, he does not pretend to know exactly how things will unfold. He only knows that silence is not an option, that if relief and deliverance come from another place, they will come, but that there is also something that Esther herself must decide. His most famous words are framed as a question, not a command. Who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? The question format is itself significant. He is not claiming to have divine knowledge of Esther's purpose. He is offering a possibility, a framework for understanding her position that might help her find the courage to act. He is saying, what if all of this has been preparation? What if the meaning of your story is about to become visible? He does not know. He is inviting her to consider the possibility, and that is, in many ways, more powerful than a direct command would be, because it places the decision where it belongs, in Esther herself. The festival of Purim, established at the story's end, is an act of intentional memory. Human communities that have experienced trauma or deliverance face a recurring challenge. How to remember what happened in ways that remain vivid and meaningful to generations who did not experience it. The Jewish answer, here as elsewhere in the tradition, is to make the remembering itself a feast, a celebration, a social event that binds community together around the memory. Purim is celebrated with feasting and drinking, and the exchange of gifts and the giving of portions to the poor. It involves reading the Book of Esther aloud, with the congregation making noise to drown out Haman's name every time it is mentioned. It involves costumes and humour, and a deliberate inversion of the solemnity that might otherwise accompany a story about near extermination. This is wise. The story of Esther is, among other things, a story about the reversibility of what seems irreversible, about the way that what appears to be an ending can be a turning point. The Purim celebration enacts this reversal theatrically. Mourning turns to gladness. Sorrow becomes a holiday. The name associated with death is drowned in noise. The community rehearses year after year the memory of a time when everything seemed lost and then was not. For people living in exile, as the Jewish community was during the period of Esther's story, this kind of memory is not merely historical. It is functional. It keeps alive the understanding that present suffering is not the final word, that the powerful do not always prevail, that the decree that seems irreversible may meet a counter-decree, that a young woman who reveals her identity at the right moment can change the fate of a people, that the gallows built for one person may receive another, that the king who cannot sleep may open a chronicle at exactly the right page. The story is about the structure of hope, the way that hope is not optimism, not the belief that things will certainly work out, but the refusal to treat the current moment as the final one. Esther herself, as a figure of leadership, offers something that more traditionally heroic narratives often miss. She is not superhuman. She's afraid when she approaches the king uninvited. She is careful and strategic in how she reveals her purpose. She uses the tools available to her, her position, her relationship with the king, her skill in human interaction, rather than relying on some power that transcends her situation. She's working within the system rather than outside it, using the protocols of the court rather than breaking them. And this is, in many ways, the most realistic kind of courage, the kind that takes the world as it is and looks for the place within it, where a person can do what must be done. There is also something important in the fact that Esther's identity is hidden for most of the narrative. She's been living at the intersection of two worlds, the Persian court and the Jewish community, carrying both without advertising the combination. This experience of holding multiple identities, of knowing oneself to belong to a people and a tradition that is not the dominant one in the environment where one operates, is familiar to many people throughout history and in the present. The management of this double life is exhausting and sometimes dangerous, but it also creates a particular kind of awareness, a sensitivity to the gap between how things appear and how they actually are, between the public performance of life and its private reality. When Esther finally reveals her identity, the moment is not only personally significant, it is the thing that makes justice possible. The king cannot help people he does not know are in danger. He cannot respond to a threat he has not been told about. Esther's revelation is the act that makes the king's power available for the right purpose, rather than the wrong one. She does not merely save her people by speaking up. She connects the king's power to the actual situation, providing the information that allows him to redirect his authority. This is, in miniature, a model of how change often happens in institutions and systems, not through external pressure alone, but through someone within the system choosing to reveal what they know, to name what is happening, to make visible what has been invisible. The Empire of Persia, in the Book of Esther, is not portrayed as evil in itself. It is portrayed as a system that can be used for either destruction or protection, depending on whose agenda currently controls it. Haman directed the system toward annihilation. Esther and Mordecai redirect it toward preservation. The king himself, not a particularly thoughtful or morally discerning figure in the narrative, is capable of both signing the decree against the Jews and signing the counter-decree that gives them the right to defend themselves. He is moved by the last person, who made a persuasive argument in his presence. This is not admirable, but it is familiar. And the story acknowledges that working within such a system requires understanding how it works, rather than expecting it to operate by higher principles than it actually has. What endures from the story is not primarily a lesson in political strategy, though the political dimensions are genuinely instructive. What endures is something more personal and more universal. It is the image of a person at the edge of a decision, standing in royal robes outside a throne room, knowing that what happens next is genuinely uncertain, and choosing to step forward anyway. If I perish, I perish. These 4 words carry the entire weight of moral courage. They acknowledge the reality of danger. They refuse to let that danger be the deciding factor. They recognize that there are things more important than personal safety, that the claims of community and conscience in this particular moment in history are more pressing than the understandable desire to protect oneself. Every person who has ever stood at such a threshold, facing a decision whose outcome is genuinely uncertain, where action could cost them something real and silence would be the safer path, encounters something of themselves in Esther's story. The specific context is ancient Persia. The form is royal protocol and imperial decree. But the interior experience of weighing risk against responsibility, of receiving the challenge that suggests your whole life has been preparation for this moment, of finding the courage to believe that even if the worst happens, it is still better to act than to be silent. This is not historical. This is permanent. The book closes with Esther and Mordecai established in positions of influence, the Jewish people preserved and celebrating, and the festival of Purim founded as an annual memory. But before it closes, it quietly notes that God's name is still not there. The preservation of an entire people has been accomplished through human courage, human strategy, human relationships, and whatever it is that guides a king's sleeplessness toward a particular page in the Chronicles on a particular night. The story does not demand that you call this providence. It simply shows you what providence might look like when it declines to announce itself. And it leaves you with a question that has no final answer, but has animated human reflection for thousands of years. Looking at your own life, at the particular collection of circumstances and losses and skills and positions that constitute your story, is it possible that some of what seemed merely to happen to you was actually preparation for something that has not yet arrived? Is it possible that the moment for which you have been positioned, perhaps without knowing it, is still approaching? Is it possible that even now, in whatever ordinary day you occupy, there is a sleepless king somewhere who is about to open a chronicle, and that what happens next depends on whether you are willing to put on your royal robes and walk toward the threshold? Who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? The question hangs there, patient and open, the way that the most important questions always do, not demanding an answer, not promising that the answer will be comfortable or safe, simply asking, simply wondering, simply suggesting that the story, your story, may be larger and stranger, and more carefully arranged than you have yet understood. And in that wondering, in that openness to the possibility that the ordinary details of an ordinary life may be moving towards something that has not yet become visible, there is something that functions very much like hope, not certainty, not a guarantee, but the refusal to close the book before the last page has been written, the willingness to remain present to the story you're in, because the story you're in may be exactly the one that needs you in it. The city of Susa, in the end, is glad. The Jewish communities in 127 provinces breathe again. Mordecai walks through the streets in blue and white, crowned with gold. Esther sits in the palace she entered as an orphan with a secret and rules, now as a queen whose identity is known, and whose courage is part of the record. And somewhere in all of that, in the gap between what was planned for destruction and what actually happened, in the space between Haman's gallows and Mordecai's horse, in the reversal of the decree, the overturning of the verdict, the survival of the condemned, there is something that the text declines to name but that every reader feels. It is the sense that behind the visible machinery of empires and decrees and court politics and human pride and human fear, something else is also operating. Something patient, something precise, something that works through the courage of one young woman and the stubbornness of one old man at the gate, through the sleeplessness of a king and the timing of a chronicle, through the very pride of a villain which becomes the instrument of his undoing. Something that does not need to announce itself to be real. The Book of Esther does not tell you what to call that something. It only shows you what it looks like when it is at work, and then it establishes a feast and says, remember this. Every year, remember this. Eat and drink and give to one another and give to the poor and make noise when the enemy's name is spoken. And remember that what seemed irreversible was reversed, that what seemed certain was undone, that the night that looked like the end turned out to be the night before the turning. Remember that there was a young woman who stood at the edge of a throne room and said, If I perish, I perish. Remember that she did not perish. Remember that the people she carried into that room with her, hidden in the story she told the king over wine and a carefully prepared dinner, they did not perish either. Remember that the moment required exactly the person who was there, and then ask yourself, quietly, in whatever ordinary circumstances you inhabit right now, whatever palace or gate or ordinary room you occupy, what moment might be requiring exactly you? What truth you might be positioned to speak that no one else in your particular situation can speak? What people might be waiting, without knowing they are waiting, for whatever courage you have been all this time, through all of it, quietly preparing,